Imagine for a moment that you have been gently released into the night, and the night has no end. You are drifting now, weightless and unhurried, through a place that astronomers have called the Great Nothing. It is real, it has a name, and yet it is almost entirely empty. This is the Boötes Void. It was first noticed in the early 1980s when a young astronomer named Robert Kirshner was surveying the sky, carefully mapping out where galaxies clustered and where they did not. What he found was astonishing. There, in the direction of the constellation Boötes the Herdsman, was a region of space nearly 330 million light-years across, where almost nothing lived. No glowing spirals, no bright ellipticals, no clusters of stars calling out across the dark. Just absence. To put that in softer terms, if our own Milky Way galaxy were a single grain of sand resting on a long beach, the Boötes Void would be the ocean beside it. It is one of the largest known voids in the observable universe, a cosmic bubble of near-nothingness so vast that light itself takes hundreds of millions of years to cross from one side to the other. And yet, it is not truly nothing. Drift with me a little further. As you float through this quiet expanse, you would notice, if you waited patiently enough, the faintest glimmers here and there. Scattered like distant lanterns, perhaps 60 or so galaxies do call this emptiness home. They are alone, these galaxies, no neighbors to dance with gravitationally, no companions to merge with across the eons. Just isolated islands of light, suspended in a sea of dark, each one holding its own billions of stars and its own quiet civilizations of dust and gas. Scientists have wondered why. How could such a vast region form with so few galaxies inside it? Some believe it grew from the joining of many smaller voids, like soap bubbles merging into one enormous bubble over billions of years. Others suggest that in the earliest moments of the universe, a rare ripple of negative density, a slight thinning of the cosmic fabric, left this region just a little emptier than everywhere else. And that small difference grew, slowly and patiently, into the great hollow we see today. There is something profoundly peaceful about this idea that emptiness itself can be shaped by time, that nothingness can have a history, that the universe does not only build but also forgets. Sometimes it simply leaves a room unfurnished. If you were drifting here, you would see almost no stars up close, no planets to pass, no nebulae swirling with color, just the deep, velvet black of interstellar space, punctuated only by the occasional smudge of a faraway galaxy. The distances between those galaxies would be unimaginable, tens of millions of light-years of perfect stillness, of gentle, silent dark. And behind that dark, on the very edge of perception, you would see the faint glow of the cosmic microwave background, the ancient light released when the universe was still a baby, just 380,000 years old. That light has traveled for nearly 14 billion years to reach this lonely place. It arrives from all directions, almost perfectly uniform, a soft hum of warmth at the edge of detectability, a whisper from the beginning of everything. This is what it means to drift through the Boötes Void. It is not frightening, it is not loud, it is simply spacious, a place where the universe has exhaled and held its breath and waited, a place where time moves the same as everywhere else, but where there is so much less to interrupt it. Perhaps there is comfort in that, in knowing that even the cosmos has its quiet corners, its empty rooms, its long, unhurried pauses between one galaxy and the next, that somewhere in the great cathedral of everything there is a chapel of almost nothing, and it is still beautiful, still real, still part of the whole. So rest here a moment in this gentle dark. Let the distances unspool. Let the silence settle around you like a soft blanket. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to see, nothing you need to solve, just the slow drift, the slow breath, and the soft glow of 60 lonely galaxies keeping watch over the great nothing. Good night, traveler. Beyond the familiar warmth of our sun, beyond the reach of any star at all, there is a darkness that is not empty, but quiet. It is in this quiet that we find the wandering worlds, the lonely rogue planets that drift forever through the cold spaces between the stars. Most of the planets we know live in families. They orbit a sun, held close by its gentle gravity, warmed by its light. We are one of those planets, Earth, a small blue world nestled in the arms of a spiral galaxy. For billions of years, we have danced with our sun, and the sun has danced with us. It is a relationship so steady that it can be easy to forget. There are other ways to live in a galaxy. Astronomers believe that our Milky Way alone may contain billions upon billions of planets that do not belong to any star. Some were born like the rest of us, in the swirling disks of gas and dust that surround young suns. But early in their lives, something changed. Perhaps a passing star pulled too close, tugging them loose with its gravity. Perhaps they were thrown out by the slow, heavy dance of giant planets in their system. Or perhaps they formed in the emptiest regions of space, condensing from clouds of drifting material without ever belonging to a sun at all. And so they wander, drifting through the galaxy in slow, enormous orbits that can take millions of years to complete. They carry no light of their own, no sun rises over their horizons, no warmth ever kisses their surface, unless, by some rare chance, they pass close to a star and borrow a little of its glow for a moment before moving on. Some of these wandering worlds may be small, no bigger than our moon, or even smaller, cold, frozen wanderers that have never known warmth, but some may be truly enormous. There is evidence that some rogue planets could be many times the mass of Jupiter, enormous spheres of gas gliding silently through the void. In the darkness, a thick atmosphere might keep them warm on the inside, heated only by the slow squeeze of their own gravity and the faint glow of radioactive decay deep within. Imagine standing on a cloud, somewhere in the heart of such a world, and looking up at a sky without a single star that you can call your own. Though, of course, all the distant suns would still shine, just a little dimmer, just a little farther away. It is a lonely thought, perhaps, but it can also be a peaceful one. There is something beautiful about the idea of a world with no obligations, no day to follow the sun across the sky, no seasons that turn with the tilt of an orbit, just a slow, endless glide through the quiet dark. The galaxy itself, after all, is not so different. Our Milky Way is part of a small collection of galaxies called the local group, and that little family drifts together through an even larger universe. In time, even our sun will not be what it is today. Stars grow old, and one day ours will swell into a red giant and then settle into a quiet white dwarf. But that is a story for another, far distant night. For now, we can simply rest in this thought, that out there, in the dark between the stars, there are worlds that have been wandering for longer than our solar system has existed. They do not hurry, they do not shine, they simply move, slowly, calmly, endlessly through a universe that has plenty of room for everyone. And if you ever feel a little untethered, a little lost, drifting through your own dark, maybe it is some small comfort to know that even whole worlds can do the same and still keep moving, still keep going through the long, peaceful night of space. Let that thought settle in. Let your breathing slow. There is no rush. The stars will be where they are. The wandering worlds will keep their ancient, quiet paths, and you here now can simply rest. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge there, what we can see, beyond the last flicker of starlight, the universe is talking, not in words, not in any language we recognize, but in pulses, in whispers, in tiny bursts of energy that travel for billions of years before brushing against our antennas like a leaf landing on still water. These are the unexplained signals, the messages that arrive from the deep, dark places between the stars, and we still don't fully know what they mean. In 1977, on a quiet August night at a radio telescope in Ohio, a volunteer astronomer named Jerry Amon stared at a printout of incoming data. He was scanning the sky for something, anything unusual. And then, his eyes caught a sequence of letters and numbers so striking that he circled them in red pen and wrote a single word beside them. Wow. The signal had lasted just 72 seconds. It came from the direction of Sagittarius, from somewhere near the stars of our own Milky Way, or perhaps from much, much farther away. It never repeated, and in all the years since, despite careful listening, we have never heard it again. It was real, it was measured, and it remains, to this day, one of the great quiet mysteries of the sky. Then there are the things scientists call fast radio bursts, FRBs for short. These are the briefest, most powerful flashes of radio energy ever detected from beyond our galaxy. Some of them last only a few milliseconds, less than the blink of an eye, and yet, in that tiny moment, they release as much energy as our sun produces in an entire day. Most of them come from galaxies so distant that their light has been traveling toward us for billions of years. We are only now hearing something that happened before the Earth even finished forming. Some of them repeat, coming again and again from the same patch of sky, like a lighthouse, or a heartbeat, or perhaps a calling. We don't know what causes them. There are theories, of course, merging stars, collapsed remnants of dead suns, magnetic fields twisted around exotic objects we have yet to fully understand. But the truth is, we don't know, and that not knowing is part of what makes the cosmos so gentle on the mind. There are still places where mystery lives, still questions without answers, still whispers without translations. And then there are the pulsars. The first one was discovered in 1967 by a young researcher named Jocelyn Bell Burnell. The signal was so regular, so precise, so unlike anything natural, that her team half-jokingly wondered if they had found evidence of an alien civilization. They even labeled the source LGM-1, standing for Little Green Men. But it wasn't little green men. It was a pulsar, a rapidly spinning neutron star, smaller than a city, denser than anything we can imagine, sending out beams of radio energy with each rotation like a cosmic lighthouse. Some of them spin hundreds of times every second, and they have been doing so for millions of years. The universe, it turns out, is full of rhythms, of pulses, of patterns that repeat and patterns that never come again. Some we understand, some we don't, and all of them are worth listening for. There is a program called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. For decades, scientists have turned massive dishes toward distant stars, hoping to catch a signal that is unmistakably artificial. They listen to thousands of stars at a time. They sift through static and noise and interference from our own satellites. They wait patiently, year after year, for a whisper that might be someone else. And the listening continues. Around the world, in observatories built into deserts and mountaintops and valleys, antennas scan the sky. They work while we sleep. They listen when no one is watching. They gather data so vast it fills warehouses of computers, all in the hope of catching just one more note in the great cosmic song. So tonight, as you rest, imagine the radio telescopes turning slowly under a sky full of stars. Imagine the dishes in the deserts of California, the forests of West Virginia, the plains of Australia, all of them listening, all of them patient. Somewhere out there, signals are arriving, some we have already heard, some we are still waiting for. And perhaps, in the quiet, between one breath and the next, you might even feel that you have heard one too, a small whisper from far away, a soft pulse of something we cannot quite name. The void is not empty, it is full of voices, and we are only just beginning to learn how to listen. Imagine a cold December night, the year 1914, along the western front of the First World War. The trenches stretch for miles, a grey scar across the countryside. The wind carries the faint scent of frost and pine. Soldiers on both sides huddle in their dugouts, their breath forming small clouds in the moonlit air. It is Christmas Eve. Now you might have heard of this story before, but tonight we will take it slowly, gently, like a soft snowfall. It is a story of an unlikely pause, a strange coincidence of peace in the midst of war. Even though it belongs to the First World War, its echo carries into the Second, reminding us that even in the darkest times, small moments of humanity can appear. In the days leading up to Christmas, an unusual quiet settles over the front lines. The usual crack of rifle fire grows sparse. Then from the German trenches, a sound drifts across no man's land. It is a song, Still Nacht or Silent Night. The melody is clear, sweet, and unexpected. British soldiers listen, at first cautious, then curious. Some of them join in, singing back in English. The two voices rise together, separated by only a few hundred yards of frozen mud and barbed wire. As the song fades, a German soldier stands up, holding a small Christmas tree above his head. Its candles flicker against the dark sky. He calls out, "Merry Christmas." Others follow, and soon soldiers from both sides emerge from their trenches, unarmed, meeting in the middle. They shake hands, exchange cigarettes, chocolate, and buttons. They share photographs of their families back home. They help each other bury the dead that had lain between the lines. And in some places, they even play a game of football, kicking a tin can or a makeshift ball in the snow. This was the Christmas truce of 1914. It was not a single event, but a series of spontaneous local ceasefires. It happened because of a simple shared human need for warmth, for connection, for a moment of peace. The coincidences that made it possible are strange and beautiful. The weather was cold but clear, perfect for carols to carry. The timing of Christmas, a holiday important to both sides, provided a natural pause. And perhaps most importantly, the soldiers were exhausted, disillusioned, and far from home. They were not enemies by nature, but by circumstance. Now let us consider how this relates to the Second World War, which you asked about. During WWII, there were similar, though smaller, moments of peace. For example, on Christmas Eve 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, a German mother named Elizabeth Vinken lived in a small cabin in the forest near the front lines. She heard a knock on her door. It was a young American soldier, lost and shivering. She let him in. Then another knock came. This time it was a German soldier, also lost. Inside the cabin, the two soldiers faced each other, weapons raised. But the mother, seeing the fear and cold in their eyes, said, "Put down your guns, it is Christmas." She gave them food and a place to sleep. The next morning, the two soldiers left separately, each returning to their own lines, but they had shared a moment of peace. Another strange coincidence occurred on Christmas Day 1943 in the Pacific. A group of Japanese and American soldiers on a small island paused their fighting to share a rare moment of silence. They had been fighting for weeks, but on that day, both sides ceased fire as if by mutual agreement. They did not sing together, but they did not fight. They simply watched the sun rise over the ocean, each side thinking of home. These moments are fragile, like the faint glow of a candle in a storm. They remind us that even in the midst of war, the human spirit can find a way to reach out. The Christmas truce of 1914 is the most famous, but its echoes are felt throughout history. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, imagine yourself in that quiet field, the snow falling softly, the distant sound of a harmonica, and the warmth of a shared smile between strangers. Let the peace of that moment settle over you like a gentle blanket, and let your mind rest. Imagine, if you will, a world before the war, a world of dust and open roads, where the idea of a small, rugged vehicle was just a whisper in the minds of a few inventors. It was the late 1930s, and the United States Army realized they needed a light, all-terrain reconnaissance vehicle, something that could go where horses and motorcycles could not, something reliable and simple. They put out a call, and 3 companies answered: Willys-Overland, Ford, and the American Bantam Car Company. The story of the Jeep begins not with a bang, but with a gentle hum of creativity and a race against time. The American Bantam Car Company, a small struggling firm, was the first to submit a prototype. They worked feverishly, hand-building a vehicle that weighed just over 2,000 pounds. It was called the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, and it was a marvel of ingenuity. But the Army wanted something even more robust, so Willys and Ford stepped in, refining the design. Willys created the Quad, and Ford made the Pygmy. These names sound almost playful now, like nicknames for beloved pets. But each vehicle was a testament to American can-do spirit, born from the quiet hum of factories and the steady hands of engineers. The army tested them all, driving them through mud, over rocks, through streams. They wanted a vehicle that could handle anything, yet be easy to repair. In the end, the Willys' design won out, but Ford was brought in to build them too, to meet the massive demand. The vehicle was standardized as the truck, 1 4-ton, 4x4 command reconnaissance. But the soldiers themselves gave it a simpler name, Jeep. There are many stories about where the name came from. Some say it came from the Popeye comic strip character Eugene the Jeep, a magical creature that could go anywhere and solve any problem. Others say it came from the Army term GP for general purpose. Whatever the origin, the name stuck, like a soft whisper that became a chorus. And so the Jeep was born, not as a weapon of war, but as a workhorse, a helper, a gentle giant of the battlefield. It was a simple machine, a flat hood, round headlights, a fold-down windshield, and a canvas top. You could drive it with the doors off, feeling the breeze. It had a top speed of about 60 miles per hour, but it was happiest at a slow crawl over rough terrain. Soldiers used it for everything, carrying messages, towing supplies, even as an ambulance. It was a friend in a world of chaos. Picture a quiet morning in the French countryside, just after a light rain. A Jeep is parked near a stone wall, its olive drab paint soft in the mist. The engine ticks gently as it cools. Two soldiers sit on the hood, sharing a simple breakfast of crackers and coffee. They talk in low voices about home, about family, about the future. The Jeep is their quiet companion, a silent witness to their hopes and fears. It doesn't ask for much, just a little fuel and some occasional care. Its tires are caked with mud, its fenders scratched, but it runs like a charm. Across the ocean, in factories in Toledo, Ohio, and elsewhere, workers built these vehicles by the thousands. Men and women, young and old, worked in shifts, their hands moving with practiced ease. They bolted on fenders, connected wires, tightened lug nuts. Each Jeep was a small piece of a larger puzzle, a contribution to a cause. The factory floors hummed with the sound of machinery, a steady rhythm that was almost lullaby-like. And when each Jeep rolled off the assembly line, it was given a serial number, a small identity, before being shipped off to a world it would help heal. The Jeep became a symbol of resilience. It was used in every theater of the war, from the sands of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific. It carried generals and privates, nurses and reporters. It was even used by the Red Cross and the USO to bring comfort to troops. In the midst of destruction, the Jeep was a small, reliable friend. Its gentle story is one of simplicity and service, of being there when needed, without fuss. After the war, the Jeep found a new life. Soldiers returning home bought surplus Jeeps and used them on farms, in forests, and on family adventures. The Jeep had become a part of the American dream, a vehicle for exploration and freedom. Its design influenced generations of off-road vehicles, and its spirit lives on in every rugged SUV today. But the original Jeep, the one from the war, remains a quiet legend. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important things are the simplest, and that even in the darkest times, a gentle, reliable friend can make all the difference. So as you drift off to sleep, think of the Jeep. Picture it parked in a field of wildflowers, its engine silent, its headlights dim. The moonlight catches the dust on its hood. It is at peace, a gentle witness to history, and in that peace you too can find rest. Imagine a quiet evening in London in 1940. The sky is beginning to darken, and the streets are slowly emptying. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and coal smoke. Then a sound begins to rise, a low, steady wail that swells and falls, like a creature calling from the distance. It is the air raid siren, a familiar voice in the night. But this is not a sound of panic. Over the months, the people of London have learned to move with a calm, practiced rhythm. They gather their things, a blanket, a small bag, perhaps a book or a flask of tea, and they make their way to the shelter. Inside the Anderson shelter, tucked into the back garden, the world shrinks to a small, corrugated room. The walls are curved, like a metal cave, and the floor is covered with a few old rugs and cushions. The family sits together, perhaps a mother and father, two children and a grandmother. They have brought a candle which flickers gently, casting soft shadows on the metal. The children are not afraid. They have made this a kind of game, a quiet adventure. The little boy traces circles in the condensation on the wall, while his sister reads aloud from a worn storybook, her voice soft and steady. The air smells of earth and wool, and the distant thump of bombs is muffled, like a heartbeat in another room. In the larger public shelters, the scene is different but equally calm. The underground station, with its tiled walls and echoing tunnels, has become a vast underground village. Hundreds of people lie side by side on blankets and mattresses, some with pillows, others with nothing but a coat folded under their heads. The lights are dim, a few bare bulbs strung along the platform, and the air is warm with the breath of so many. A woman knits by the wall, her needles clicking a gentle rhythm. Two men play chess on a small board, their moves slow and deliberate. Someone has a harmonica, playing a soft, unfamiliar tune. The sound of a kettle boiling somewhere drifts through the crowd, and a volunteer passes with a tray of cups, offering tea. The mood is not one of fear, but of quiet endurance. People talk in low voices, sharing stories, or simply sitting in silence, their eyes distant but peaceful. There is a kind of intimacy in these shelters. Strangers become neighbors, and neighbors become friends. A mother shares her ration of chocolate with the child next to her. An old man tells a story of the last war, his voice low and weary. A young couple whispers together, their heads close, their hands intertwined. The children, after a while, grow sleepy. They lie down on their parents' laps, their eyes closing, their breathing slow. The adults watch over them, their faces soft in the half-light. The bombs continue above, but they are distant now, like a storm passing over the horizon. Time in the shelter moves slowly, without the usual rush of daylight hours. There is no clock visible, only the slow crawl of the candle flame. People read by the light of a torch or listen to a small radio, its volume turned low, broadcasting a classical piece or a calm voice reading the news. Some simply close their eyes and drift, allowing their minds to wander to simpler times. A sunny afternoon, a picnic in the country, the sound of birds in the garden. The shelter becomes a place of reflection, a quiet pocket of time where the world outside is held at bay. Then, after what feels like hours, the siren sounds again, but this time it is a single, steady note, the all clear. The signal is softer, more like a sigh of relief. People stir, stretch, and begin to gather their belongings. The children are woken gently, their eyes blinking in the dim light. The chess game is put away, the knitting needles packed, the cups collected. The doors are opened, and a cool night air rushes in, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint, distant glow of a city that has survived another night. They step out into the quiet streets, under a sky that is beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The shelter is empty again, waiting for the next night, but for now there is peace. And so the night passes, as it did for so many in those years, a slow, steady rhythm of waiting, of quiet companionship, of small comforts. The memory of those shelters lingers, not as a place of fear, but as a place of gentle, shared humanity. A soft, warm memory of how people, in the most difficult times, found a way to be calm, to be kind, and to help each other fall asleep. Imagine a quiet night on a Pacific island, the kind of night where the stars seem to hold their breath. The air is warm, thick with the scent of salt and damp earth, and the only sounds are the distant rustle of palm fronds and the occasional chirp of a night bird. In a small radio tent, a young Marine sits with a headset, his fingers resting lightly on a transmitter. He is not typing in English, not using any code you might know. He is speaking in a language older than the mountains, a language of wind and rain, of canyon walls and mesas. This is the language of the Navajo people, and on this night, it is carrying the most important messages of the war. Long before the war, the Navajo lived in a land of vast skies and red earth, where stories were passed down in whispers around fires. Their language, Diné Bizard, was complex, tonal, and unwritten. It had no alphabet, no dictionaries for outsiders. The US military, desperate for a code the Japanese could never break, turned to these young Navajo men. They were not soldiers at first, but they became the silent voice of the Marine Corps, a secret weapon of words. The idea came from a man named Philip Johnston, a civil engineer who had grown up on the Navajo reservation. He knew the language was like a puzzle no one else could solve. The military listened. Soon, hundreds of Navajo men were recruited, taken from their homes in Arizona and New Mexico, and brought to training camps. They were not asked to fight with rifles, but to memorize a code book of 211 words, then expand it to over 400. They created words for modern warfare. A dive bomber became a chicken hawk, a submarine became a metal fish, and a battleship was called a whale. The code was built on the sounds of their world, a world of cliffs and creatures, of prayer and patience. Think of the quiet concentration these men possessed. They had to remember every word, every combination, without any written notes. In the heat of battle, when the enemy was listening, they would speak into the radio, their voices calm and steady. They could send and receive a message in minutes, while the mechanical code machines took hours. The Japanese, masters of code breaking, were baffled. They heard random syllables, sounds that seemed like nothing. They could not even find a pattern. The Navajo code was never broken, not once. These men served in every major battle in the Pacific: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo code talkers worked around the clock, sending over 800 messages with no errors. They were the ones who called in the first reports of the flag raising, the ones who coordinated the final assault. They did it quietly, without fanfare, often in the thick of danger. They were not allowed to talk about their work, even after the war. For decades, their story was a secret, a whisper among the Navajo elders. Picture a young man, maybe 18 years old, sitting on a hillside back home, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. He remembers the words his grandfather taught him, the names of the clouds, the way the wind carries messages. Now he is 1,000 miles away, on a ship, in a jungle, using those same words to save lives. He speaks of tortoises for tanks and birds for airplanes. He speaks of the enemy as a Gila monster. And when he is done, he says nothing, because the silence is part of the honor. The war ended, and the code talkers returned to their reservations, to their families, to a life of quiet work. Many became farmers, teachers, artists. They did not speak of their service. It was not until 1968, when the code was declassified, that the world began to learn of their sacrifice. In 2001, the surviving code talkers were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, but the true gift they gave was not a medal. It was the sound of their language, used for peace, for protection, for a cause greater than themselves. So tonight, as you lie here, let your mind drift to that island, to that radio tent, to the soft voices of men who spoke in code. Let the rhythm of their words, the names of the animals and the stars, carry you into a gentle sleep. The war is long over, the battles are silent, but the echoes of their voices remain, a lullaby of courage and calm. Rest now, rest quietly, knowing that the work of the code talkers was a gift of silence, and that silence is here with you, safe and still. Imagine, if you will, a world where the simple act of driving to the store or taking a bicycle to visit a friend becomes a memory, a luxury of a bygone era. This was the world during the Second World War, when a quiet, humble material, rubber, became one of the most precious and strategic resources on the planet. Tonight we will drift together into that time, not with the roar of engines or the crackle of battle, but with the soft, steady hum of a nation learning to recycle, to ration, and to adapt. This is the story of how rubber was rationed and recycled, a tale of quiet ingenuity and collective sacrifice, told in a calm, gentle whisper, like a bedtime story for a weary world. Before the war, rubber was everywhere, in tires, in hoses, in boots, in the gaskets that sealed engines, and in the simple erasers on pencils. Most of it came from faraway places, the rubber trees of Southeast Asia, the plantations of the Dutch East Indies, and the vast forests of the Amazon. It was a global web of trade, a river of latex flowing into factories and homes. But when war broke out, that river began to dry up. Japan swept through the rubber-producing regions, cutting off the Allies from 90% of the world's natural rubber supply. Suddenly, A resource that had seemed as common as air became as precious as gold. The United States, Great Britain, and their allies faced a crisis. Without rubber, tanks couldn't move, planes couldn't fly, and even the simplest supply truck would be stranded. The war effort itself would grind to a halt. And so a great, quiet mobilization began, not of soldiers, but of citizens, of scrap collectors, of chemists, and of housewives. The government launched campaigns with soft, earnest posters and radio announcements, asking everyone to do their part. The message was simple: save your rubber, turn it in. Your old tire, your worn-out raincoat, your garden hose, these are now weapons of war. People responded, not with fanfare, but with a gentle, determined sense of duty. They pulled old rubber from attics and basements, from barns and garages. They brought it to collection points, schoolyards, fire stations, and town halls, where volunteers weighed it and stacked it, a growing mountain of discarded soles, inner tubes, and toys. This was not a dramatic, fiery recycling, but a quiet, methodical one. The rubber was sorted, cleaned, and then shredded into crumbs like soft, dark grains of sand. These crumbs were then mixed with new rubber or with synthetic substitutes to create a material that was still strong enough for tires, still flexible for gaskets, still waterproof for boots. The process was slow, almost meditative, a gentle cycle of renewal. Factories that once made tennis balls now made tank treads. Shoe factories turned out combat boots from recycled soles, and every piece of rubber, no matter how small, was precious. Even the rubber bands from around the morning newspaper were saved, collected, and sent to the war effort. It was a quiet, collective act of thrift, a kind of national meditation on the value of things. Rationing, too, was a gentle but firm reality. Civilians were allowed only a few gallons of gasoline per week, not just to save fuel, but because every mile driven wore down tires. The government issued ration books with stamps for tires, for shoes, for boots. To buy a new tire, one had to prove it was absolutely necessary, and even then, it might be made of reclaimed rubber, a patchwork of former lives. People learned to drive slowly, to avoid sharp turns, to keep their tires inflated just right, to make them last as long as possible. Bicycles became common again, their tires carefully patched and repatched. And when a tire finally gave out, it was not thrown away, but taken to a collection center where it would begin its quiet journey back into the war effort. This story has a gentle, almost poetic rhythm. It is the rhythm of a nation learning to live with less, to mend what was broken, to find value in what was discarded. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is a quiet, steady light of human ingenuity and cooperation. So as you lie here, listening to the soft fall of words, imagine that old rubber, once part of a child's toy or a farmer's boot, being transformed again and again into something new. It is a cycle that never truly ends, a lullaby of renewal. And now, let your mind drift, like those soft rubber crumbs, into a peaceful, restful night. Imagine for a moment the quiet remote hum of a vast, unseen machine. It is not the roar of engines or the crack of rifles, but the steady, patient pulse of an army's feeding. This is the story of how millions of soldiers were kept alive, not by heroism, but by logistics. In the Second World War, feeding an army was a challenge that dwarfed any battle. It was a daily miracle of planning, of supply lines stretching across oceans and continents, of cans of beans and sacks of flour that whispered of home. Consider the American soldier stationed in the European theater. His daily ration, the beloved K-ration, was a small cardboard box about the size of a thick novel. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were 3 meals, a breakfast, a dinner, and a supper. The breakfast might include a small can of processed meat, a packet of crackers, and a tiny bar of chocolate, a D-ration bar which was so hard it could almost break a tooth. The dinner was perhaps a tin of cheese or a can of meat and vegetable hash. The supper might be a can of beef stew with a spoon that folded into the lid. All of this was designed to be compact, durable, and to provide about 3,000 calories, enough for a soldier on the move. But it was not just about calories. It was about morale. The taste of a familiar meal, even a canned one, reminded a soldier of the world he had left behind. Now picture the scale. The United States, by the war's end, had produced over 1.5 billion C rations and 1.1 billion K rations. That is a staggering number of cans, each one a small container of hope. The packaging was a marvel of its time. The cans were hermetically sealed, often with a key that rolled back a strip of metal to open them. The crackers were wrapped in cellophane, a new material that kept them from going stale. The chocolate bars were made with a special formula that resisted melting, even in the heat of North Africa. The entire ration was designed to withstand the jostling of a jeep, the humidity of a jungle, the cold of a mountain. Behind each ration was a world of planning. The War Department had to decide how many men would be in the field, where they would be, and what they would need. They had to consider food allergies, religious restrictions, and the availability of local supplies. For instance, in the Pacific, soldiers often received fish instead of pork to avoid spoilage. In the deserts of North Africa, they received extra water, sometimes in metal canteens that could be used to boil water for tea. The British Army, meanwhile, relied on tinned bully beef, which was a staple of their rations. The Germans used a similar system, with their own Eisenbahn rations, which included a can of meat, a can of bread, and a small can of coffee. But the logistics went far beyond the individual soldier. Consider the supply chain. A single division of 15,000 men required about 50 tons of food per day. That food had to be loaded onto ships, transporting across the Atlantic or Pacific, unloaded at ports that were often under attack, then moved by train or truck to depots, and finally brought forward to the front lines. Each step was a potential point of failure. A single ship sunk by a U-boat could mean the loss of 10,000 meals. A truck stuck in mud could delay a regiment's lunch. The supply officers were the unsung heroes of the war, working 18-hour days to keep the flow steady. And then there was the issue of spoilage. In the heat of the jungles, canned goods could swell and burst. In the cold of the Ardennes, the water in cans could freeze, cracking the tin. The military experimented with dehydration, creating powdered eggs, milk, and potatoes. These were lighter to transport but often tasted, as one soldier said, like cardboard. Still, they were vital. The British, in particular, relied on dehydrated foods to save shipping space. The compo ration, used by the British Army, was a 24-hour pack that included oatmeal, biscuits, and a can of jam. It was dull but nourishing. Of course, the soldiers themselves often improvised. They would barter with locals, using chocolate or cigarettes for fresh bread or eggs. In Italy, soldiers traded army rations for wine. In the Pacific, they learned to fish and hunt. The Red Cross provided coffee, donuts, and sometimes even ice cream. The USO put on shows, and the Salvation Army served hot cocoa. These small comforts were as important as the rations themselves. As the war went on, the logistics became more efficient. The advent of the 10-in-1 ration, designed for a small group of soldiers, allowed for more variety. It included canned meats, vegetables, fruits, and even a small can of cocoa. The C ration was improved, adding items like crackers with peanut butter and jelly. The army even developed a D-ration chocolate bar that was so energy-dense that a single bar could sustain a soldier for a day. It was not delicious, but it worked. In the end, the feeding of an army was a quiet, steady effort, a testament to the power of organization. It is easy to forget, in the telling of great battles, that soldiers need to eat. They need to feel, even for a moment, that they are part of a world that cares for them. The rations, the cans, the boxes, they were small, fragile things, but they carried the weight of a war. So as you drift off to sleep, think of the cooks, the supply officers, the truck drivers, and the sailors all working in the shadows, their hands moving through the quiet of the night, ensuring that tomorrow the soldiers would have their meal. And in that small act, the war continued. Imagine a quiet island in the vast Pacific Ocean, far from the roaring battles and the grey ships that crisscrossed the seas during the Second World War. Here, the jungle is thick and green, and the only sounds are the rustle of palm fronds and the distant crash of waves against coral reefs. This is the world of the Coast Watchers, a small, scattered group of men and women whose work was silent, patient, and utterly essential. They were the eyes and ears of the Allied forces, hidden in the shadows of enemy-held islands, watching and waiting, for hours, for days, for months on end. Their heroism was not marked by explosions or charges, but by the steady, quiet courage of staying still, staying hidden, and staying alive. In the early years of the war, when Japan swept across the Pacific with terrifying speed, the Coast Watchers were often left behind, cut off from any hope of rescue. They were planters, missionaries, traders, and local islanders, people who knew the land and the sea intimately. One of them, a man named Paul Mason, sat on a ridge on the island of Bougainville with a tiny radio set hidden in a hollow log. Each day he would crank the generator by hand, carefully tap out a coded message, and then listen for the faint crackle of a reply. He could see the Japanese airfield below, the planes taking off and landing, the troops marching in formation. He counted every aircraft, noted every troop movement, and sent it all, whispered into the ether, to the Allied command. He was alone, but he was not forgotten. The pilots who would later bomb that airfield owed their lives to his patient vigilance. The Coast Watchers lived in constant danger of discovery. A single misplaced footprint, a too bright cooking fire, or a careless word could betray them to the Japanese patrols that combed the jungles. So they learned to move like shadows, to speak in whispers, to trust only those who had proven their loyalty. They built hidden huts high in the hills, sometimes in caves, camouflaged with leaves and branches. They ate what the jungle provided, coconuts, yams, the occasional fish, and they waited. The loneliness was a heavy weight, but they carried it with a kind of quiet grace. They knew that every report they sent might save a ship, a squadron, a life. Perhaps the most famous of the Coast Watchers was a young Australian officer named Reg Evans, who operated from a small island off Guadalcanal. He and his small team, including a local Solomon Islander named Jacob Vuza, watched the Japanese movements by day and by night. They sent reports that helped the Allies win the crucial Battle of Guadalcanal. But their work was not always about grand battles. Sometimes it was about small acts of kindness, rescuing a downed pilot, guiding a lost sailor, sharing a precious canteen of water with a Marine who had stumbled ashore, exhausted and wounded. These moments of quiet heroism, the gentle hand of a friend in a hostile world, are the heart of the Coast Watcher story. When the war ended, these men and women returned to their ordinary lives, often without fanfare. Many of their stories were not told until decades later, when historians uncovered the diaries and letters that spoke of their patient courage. They were not heroes in the flashy sense. They did not charge into machine gun fire or lead great armies. But they were heroes in the truest sense. They endured, they watched, and they cared. They remind us that bravery can be quiet, that hope can be passed in a whisper, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply to be present, to observe, and to share what we see. So as you drift towards sleep, think of those lonely island outposts, the rustle of the jungle, the soft glow of a radio dial, and the steady, calming heartbeat of men and women who kept watch over the world. Imagine, if you will, a world where the very shape of a tank could melt into a meadow, where a battleship could vanish beneath a painted sun, and where a soldier could become a ghost among the leaves. This was the quiet magic of camouflage in the Second World War, a science of deception as much as of art, crafted not for glory but for survival. It is a story of patterns and shadows, of clever minds and patient hands, and it unfolds with the gentle rhythm of a slow, deep breath. Let us begin in the quiet corners of England, where nature itself became a classroom. The British countryside, with its patchwork of fields and hedgerows, taught observers how light and shade break up forms. A deer standing still among the bracken is nearly invisible. Its outline dissolves into the dappled background. Scientists and artists studied this as if it were a lullaby of color, each hue a note, each shape a silence. They called it disruptive coloration, and it became the foundation of all camouflage work. Tanks were painted not in solid green, but in bands of brown, olive, and black, so that from a distance their edges seemed to fracture. A moving tank might appear as a scattered puzzle, its true shape hidden like a secret whispered in the wind. Across the English Channel, in the great workshops of Europe, other nations wove their own illusions. The Germans mastered the art of ambush painting, patterns that mimicked the play of sunlight through trees. Their soldiers wore smocks splashed with earth tones and leaf shapes, blending into forests and fields as if they had grown from the ground. The French, too, had their own quiet elegance, the horizon blue of their uniforms, which faded into the morning mist. And the Americans, with their practical eye, developed the M42 paratrooper uniform, its faint green blotches the color of damp moss. All these were born from long days of observation, of how a shadow crawls at dusk, of how a muddy bank mirrors a soldier's silhouette. But the most astonishing wonders were not on land, they were upon the sea. Picture a convoy of cargo ships, their decks heavy with supplies, steaming across the grey Atlantic. They were painted not to hide, but to confuse. This was dazzle camouflage, a dizzying geometry of zigzags and curves, of stark whites and deep blacks, of blues and greys that seemed to shift like the very water. A U-boat commander peering through a periscope could not tell if a ship was coming or going, how fast it moved, or how far away it was. The patterns broke the ship's silhouette into 1,000 fractured pieces, as if they were splinters of a dream. These ships sailed through fog and starlight, their paintwork a silent guardian, a slow dance between illusion and reality. Then there were the decoys, objects that were not what they seemed. A dummy tank made of inflatable rubber, a phantom airfield with plywood planes, a fake army of canvas shadows. These were built with the patience of a bedtime ritual, each false detail carefully placed. The Allies created entire ghost armies under the command of artists and magicians. In the desert, they built dummy supply depots that fooled German reconnaissance planes. In the forests of Belgium, they set up fake artillery batteries to draw enemy fire away from real positions. These were not acts of violence, but of quiet cunning, a trick of the light that could save thousands of lives. And beneath the oceans, submarines themselves were a form of camouflage. A U-boat slipping through deep, dark waters was painted on top with colors that matched the gray-green sea when seen from above, and underneath with paler hues to blend with the sky when seen from below. It was a lesson in balance, in the way the world turns and changes. Even the air was not exempt. Bombers were painted on their undersides with blue-gray to mimic the sky, while their tops wore the browns and greens of the earth, so that from above they seemed part of the ground, and from below part of the clouds. It was a quiet song of vanishing, a gentle disappearance. All this work was done by men and women in quiet studios, in hangars smelling of paint and linseed oil, in fields where they would lie for hours, watching shadows move. They were not fighting with guns, they were fighting with vision itself. They understood that sometimes the best way to be safe is to not be seen, to become one with the stillness around you. In the end, camouflage is not about hiding, it is about belonging. It is the art of finding your place in the world, and then becoming a part of it, like a leaf on a pond, a cloud in the sky, a whisper in the dark. So as you drift toward the gentle embrace of sleep, remember these quiet masters of illusion. They painted their hopes onto canvas and steel and sent them out into the vast, sleeping world. And perhaps, in your dreams, you too will learn the calm science of becoming invisible and find peace in the soft patterns of shadow and light. Imagine a quiet evening in a small town in America during the years of the Second World War. The war is far away, across the vast ocean, but its presence is felt in every home. In a modest living room, a mother sits at a wooden table, a single lamp casting a warm glow on the paper before her. She is writing a letter. Her pen moves slowly, carefully, choosing words that will travel across the world to reach her son. She cannot see his face, cannot hear his voice, but this thin sheet of paper is their only connection. This is the beginning of a journey that will be shorter, lighter, and faster than any ordinary letter, thanks to a little-known system called V-mail. V-mail stands for Victory Mail, a system designed to keep the bond between soldiers and their families strong, even when they were separated by thousands of miles. Before the war, sending a letter overseas was a slow, bulky process. A single crate of letters could hold only a few hundred pages, and those crates took up precious space on ships and planes. But as the war grew and millions of soldiers were sent far from home, the need for quick, reliable communication became vital. The military needed a way to move letters without weighing down the supply lines. The answer came from a technology that had been used in banking for years: microfilm. Here is how it worked, and it is a quiet, almost magical process. When a soldier wrote a letter home, he would use a special V-mail form. It was a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed, with space for his words and the address. He would write his message, perhaps a description of a sunset in a foreign land or a simple wish for a happy birthday. Then he would drop it in a mailbox, and that letter would begin its journey. But instead of being loaded onto a cargo ship as a bulky envelope, it would be sent to a central processing center. These centers, often in city buildings that had been converted for the war effort, the letters were opened, checked for security, and then photographed. They were shrunk down onto reels of microfilm, each reel holding thousands of letters. A single roll of film, no bigger than a roll of 35 camera film, could contain the equivalent of an entire mailbag. The original paper letters were then destroyed to save weight and space. Only the tiny film reels traveled onward by air to the front lines. When the film arrived at a destination like a base in England or North Africa, it was developed and printed back onto paper. The reproduced letters were smaller than the originals, about a quarter of the size, but the handwriting was clear, the words still personal. These miniature letters were then slipped into small envelopes and delivered to the soldiers. A soldier might receive a letter that had been written only a week ago, even though he was halfway around the world. The speed of air transport, combined with the efficiency of microfilm, meant that news from home could cross the globe in a matter of days, not weeks or months. The system was not just fast, it was also secure. Every letter was photographed, which meant that sensors could easily check for any sensitive information. And because the original letters were destroyed, there was no risk of a letter being lost or stolen in transit. The process was quiet, orderly, almost mechanical, yet it carried the weight of human emotion. Each tiny letter was a piece of home, a reminder of a world that was waiting. For the families at home, writing a V-mail letter was a ritual. They would choose their words carefully, knowing that the letter would be read many times and that it might be the last one they ever sent. The letters were often filled with simple, everyday details: the weather, the garden, a neighbor's news. These small things were anchors, holding the soldiers to the life they had left behind. The system was a triumph of logistics, but it was also a quiet, constant act of love. By the end of the war, over 1 billion V-mail letters had been sent. The system was a testament to the power of communication, even in the midst of chaos. Today, those letters are preserved in archives, fragile and faded, but still carrying the voices of a generation. They are a reminder that even in the darkest times, people found ways to reach out, to share, to stay connected. The V-mail system was not about battles or victories in the traditional sense. It was about the quiet, steady strength of human connection, the letters that traveled across the world, carrying hope and love and the simple wish to be remembered. In the quiet hours of history, when the world was wrapped in the shadow of war, there were silent companions who padded softly beside soldiers, their presence a gentle anchor in the storm. These were the dogs of the Second World War, not just working animals, but friends, confidants, and quiet sources of comfort. Tonight, let us drift into the stories of these loyal creatures who served with steadfast hearts, asking for nothing more than a gentle word or a scratch behind the ear. Picture a misty morning in an English village, 1940. The sound of distant aircraft fades into the low whisper of wind through hedgerows. A young soldier, barely out of boyhood, crouches beside his post. Beside him sits a sturdy black Labrador named Max. Max's ears are perked, but his eyes are soft, watching his human with calm certainty. They had met just weeks before at a training kennel, where dogs like Max were taught to be silent messengers, carrying vital notes from one outpost to another across treacherous terrain. Max learned to navigate hedgerows and streams, to avoid the noise of battle, to move like a shadow. But more than that, he learned to be a friend. In the long hours of waiting, when fear could creep in like a cold draft, Max would place his head on the soldier's knee. That small weight, the warmth of fur, was a reminder of home, of loyalty, of life beyond the conflict. Many dogs served in the war, each with a unique role. There were guard dogs who patrolled perimeters, their keen senses alerting to danger long before humans could perceive it. There were scout dogs who could detect the scent of an enemy from afar, leading patrols through dark forests with unerring accuracy. But perhaps the most touching were the search and rescue dogs, who ventured into rubble and ruin to find survivors. One such dog was a small terrier named Pip, who worked with a Red Cross team in London after the Blitz. Pip would crawl into tight spaces, his tail wagging a steady rhythm, and if he found someone alive, he would bark a single, soft bark. He never barked at death, only at life. His silence in the presence of suffering earned him the trust of rescue workers, who said Pip seemed to understand when words were too heavy. And then there were the silent companions who served simply by being there. Military hospitals and informal resting camps often had a resident dog, like a golden retriever named Bella, who would wander among cots and sleeping bags, offering her muzzle to be stroked. Bella had no official training, but she had an instinct for when a soldier needed comfort. She would lie quietly beside a trembling young man, her slow breathing a rhythm to match his own. In the absence of family, of letters from home, of the simple touch of a loved one, Bella offered a living, breathing presence that said, "I am here, you are not alone." These dogs did not understand the complex ideologies of war, but they understood loneliness, and they knew how to heal it with a gentle gaze. Even in the most chaotic moments, dogs brought a sense of normalcy. A battalion stationed in North Africa at dusk might share their meager rations with a stray that had attached itself to them. The stray, with its dusty coat and hopeful eyes, became a mascot, a living talisman. Soldiers would speak to it in low voices, confessing fears and hopes they could never share with their comrades. The dog would listen, head tilted, offering no judgment. And when the night grew dark, the dog would curl up at someone's feet, its steady heartbeat a lullaby against the distant rumble of artillery. It is said that the bonds formed in such times are among the strongest. Many soldiers, after the war, adopted the dogs they had served beside, bringing them home to quiet lives in peacetime. The dogs, once silent companions in battle, became gentle friends in gardens and living rooms. They slept by fires, chased balls, and wagged tails at the arrival of mail, simple joys earned through years of loyalty. Their stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there is a tenderness that endures, a softness that does not need words. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let your mind rest on these faithful friends. Imagine a quiet field, the scent of grass, the warmth of a dog's fur against your hand. There is no noise of war, only the slow rhythm of breath. The dog beside you is content, and so are you. Sleep, like a silent companion, will come to you gently, reminding you that even in history's heavy pages, there are moments of peace, carried in the heart of a loyal dog. Imagine it is a quiet evening in the spring of 1944. The war in Europe is raging, but in a quiet corner of England, a small group of soldiers is preparing for something entirely different. They are not training with rifles or tanks. Instead, they are learning how to paint canvas, operate powerful sound equipment, and tell convincing stories. This is the strange tale of the Ghost Army, a top-secret unit whose weapons were not bullets, but deception. The Ghost Army, officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, was a unique experiment in military illusion. Made up of artists, architects, set designers, and even a few magicians, their job was to fool the German army. They did this by creating entire phantom divisions, complete with fake tanks, trucks, and artillery, that looked real from the air and on the ground. Using inflatable rubber vehicles, sound effects recorded from real battles, and carefully crafted radio messages, they could make a handful of men seem like 1,000. One of their most famous operations was called Operation Wiesen in March 1945. The real American Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River, a crucial step toward ending the war. But the Germans had to be tricked into thinking the crossing would happen elsewhere. The Ghost Army was sent to a stretch of the river near the town of Wiesen, where they set up their inflatable tanks and trucks, played recordings of construction noises, and broadcast fake radio chatter. For 3 days, German reconnaissance planes flew overhead, photographing what they believed was a major buildup of forces. The Germans responded by moving their troops to defend against this phantom army, leaving the real crossing point lightly defended. When the actual assault came on March 23, it was a stunning success, and the Ghost Army's role was kept secret for decades. The soldiers of the Ghost Army were not just technicians, they were performers. They learned to imitate the accents of different American units, to act like they were part of a real combat division, and to create the chaos and clutter of a real military camp. They even had a special unit of actors who would impersonate generals, driving around in staff cars and saluting at the right moments. Their work was dangerous. They were often deployed very close to the front lines, but their casualties were low, thanks to the very deception they practiced. After the war, the story of the Ghost Army remained classified until the 1990s. When it was finally declassified, it fascinated historians and the public alike. Here was a group of men who fought not with guns, but with creativity and wit. Their legacy is a reminder that in war, sometimes the most powerful weapon is a good story. As you drift off into sleep, think of those quiet artists and actors working under the stars, painting fake tanks and whispering into microphones, changing the course of history with nothing more than illusion. And so, the strange tale of the Ghost Army ends not with a bang, but with a whisper, the soft hiss of an inflatable tank deflating, the distant echo of a recorded artillery barrage, and the gentle, steady breathing of soldiers who were both artists and warriors. Sleep now, and let your dreams be filled with whispers and shadows, where even the fiercest battles can be won by a clever trick. Good night. Imagine a time when the world was wrapped in conflict, yet amidst the turmoil, there was a quiet art form that spoke directly to the heart of every citizen. It was the gentle art of propaganda posters, not the shouting kind, nor the terrifying images of war, but soft, reassuring, and often beautifully drawn pictures that hung in shop windows, on the walls of train stations, and even in the quiet corners of family kitchens. These posters were not meant to scare, but to inspire calm resolve. To remind people that they were part of something greater, and that even the smallest actions could make a difference. During the Second World War, every country produced these posters, each with its own gentle character. In Britain, there was the famous "Keep Calm and Carry On," a simple crown, a soft palette of red and white, and those quiet words. It was never meant to be shouted, it was a whisper of resilience. The government printed millions, but they were held back for times of crisis. Most were never even displayed, yet the message lived on, a silent promise that calmness itself was a form of strength. Across the Atlantic, American posters often featured cheerful illustrations. The iconic "We Can Do It" showed a woman in a blue work shirt, her hair wrapped in a red polka dot scarf rolling up her sleeve. But listen closely, her expression is not fierce. She looks confident, yes, but also gentle, a nod to the millions of women who stepped into factories with quiet determination, building planes and tanks while their loved ones were away. The colors were bright but soft, like a morning sky, and the message was one of unity, everyone working together, not with anger, but with purpose. Then there were the warning posters, but even these were crafted with care. Loose Lips Sink Ships featured a sailor in quiet contemplation, or sometimes a shadowy figure, but the scene was never graphic. Instead, it was a gentle reminder, be careful what you say, for words have consequences. The illustrations were often done in muted greens and blues, like a calm sea at dusk, with no explosions or violence, just the simple image of a ship sailing peacefully, perhaps with a subtle hint that silence is golden. Artists behind these posters were not government officials. They were illustrators and painters who understood the power of a soft image. Norman Rockwell, for instance, created his Four Freedoms series with such warmth that they felt like windows into a peaceful home. A mother tucking her children into bed, a family gathered around a Thanksgiving table. These were not images of war, but of the quiet life people were fighting to protect. The paintings were reproduced as posters and distributed across America, and they brought comfort to those who felt far from home. In the Soviet Union, posters were often more dramatic, but still there was a gentleness in the way they idealized everyday heroes. A woman holding a child, a farmer tending his field under a wide sky. The colors were rich, sometimes like golden wheat, other times like soft snow. They whispered of duty, not glory, and the words were simple: our strength is in unity. Even the printing process itself was a calm craft. Artists used lithography and silkscreen, layering colors one by one, each poster taking hours to produce. The smell of ink, the sound of the press, it was a quiet industry that hummed in the background of the war. These posters were meant to last, to be passed from hand to hand, to be pinned on a bedroom wall where a child might see them and feel safe. And though the war was long and hard, these gentle images remain with us. Today they are collected and admired, not as propaganda but as art, a reminder that even in the darkest times people chose to speak softly. They chose to paint pictures of hope, of calm, of the simple dignity of going about one's day with courage. So as you drift towards sleep, picture those posters. The soft edges, the muted colors, the quiet messages telling you, even now, that all will be well. Let your mind wander through that era, not to scenes of battle, but to a quiet street where a poster hangs in a window, catching the last light of a peaceful evening. And as you breathe, let the gentle words of those posters be your lullaby. Keep calm, carry on, and rest now. As the world grew dark with war, there was a woman whose quiet brilliance flickered not in the heat of battle, but in the stillness of a Vienna apartment, then later in a Hollywood drawing room. Her name was Hedy Lamarr, and though the world remembers her as a silver screen siren, her greatest performance was never on film. It was an invention, hidden away for decades, that would one day hum in the air all around us, the seed of what we now call Wi-Fi. She was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in 1914 in a city that still carried the waltz of old Europe. Even as a girl, her mind wandered not into fairy tales, but into the machinery of her father's mind. He was a banker, but his true passion was technology. On long walks through Vienna, he would stop and explain how a streetcar worked, how a telephone carried a voice through wires. Hedy listened, and she remembered. Her mother was a concert pianist, and in the evenings, the house would fill with music. So her childhood was a gentle duet between art and science, the perfect quiet prelude for a life that would weave them together. At 16, she was discovered by a film director, and within a few years she had scandalized the world in a film called Ecstasy. But while the cameras captured her beauty, her mind was capturing something else. She married a wealthy arms dealer, Friedrich Mandel, who sold weapons to both sides of the coming conflict. At their lavish dinner parties, she would sit silently, listening to the men talk about torpedoes, radio guidance, jamming signals. She learned that a torpedo could be steered by radio, but that the enemy could simply block the frequency and send it off course. She thought about this late at night, when the chandeliers were dimmed and the guests had gone home. To escape that marriage, she fled eventually to America, to Hollywood, where she was reborn as Hedy Lamarr, the most beautiful woman in the world. But in her quiet hours, between takes and premieres, she still thought about that problem with the torpedoes. She set up a drafting table in her home, surrounded by notebooks and sketching tools. No one knew that beneath the silk gowns and studio lights was a mind that could visualize waves and circuits as easily as she could memorize a script. Then in 1940, at a dinner party, she met the composer George Antheil. He was eccentric, a pianist who had experimented with player pianos and synchronized mechanisms. Over coffee, they began to talk not about music, but about the war. And Hedy mentioned the torpedo problem. What if, she said, the radio signal could jump rapidly from one frequency to another, like a pianist playing a runaway scale, never staying on one note long enough for the enemy to jam? Anthel's eyes lit up. He understood the mechanical concept: two player piano rolls, moving at the same speed, guiding the transmitter and receiver to hop through 88 frequencies, one for each key on a piano. Together, they developed a system that would later be called frequency-hopping spread spectrum. It was elegantly simple. A boat, a plane, or a torpedo would receive a signal that jumped unpredictably across the band, and only its counterpart receiver, synced with the same pattern, could follow it. The enemy would hear only fragments, noise, nothing coherent. In August 1942, they received U.S. Patent 2,292,387, but the Navy was skeptical. How could a movie star and a composer truly understand such things? The patent was filed away, classified, never used in the war. Hedy offered to use her fame to sell war bonds, and she did, raising millions. But her invention lay dormant, a gentle seed waiting for the right season. That season came many years later, long after the war had faded into history books. In the 1950s, engineers at the Navy began to revisit frequency hopping for sonar buoys. Then, in the 1960s, a small company called Sylvania used the concept for secure military communications. And in the 1990s, the idea was woven into a new standard: Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS. Every time you stream a lullaby to a sleeping baby monitor, every time your phone connects to a network without tangling wires, you are relying on a version of Hedy Lamarr's quiet genius. She never made a fortune from it. The patent expired before the technology became widespread. But in 1997, the Electronic Frontier Foundation gave her a belated Pioneer Award. She was 82 years old, mostly homebound, and when she heard the news, she simply smiled. She said, "It's about time." Hedy Lamarr passed away in 2000, but the world hums with her invention. The frequencies dance silently through the air, jumping and hopping, never staying still, just like the mind of a woman who understood that beauty and brilliance could live in the same soul. And so tonight, as your device connects softly to the invisible network, sending and receiving whispers of data across the room, you can think of her, a quiet genius, sitting at a drafting table in the California night, dreaming of a world where signals would never be lost or silenced, only shared, gently, in a pattern that only love could follow. Close your eyes, if you like, and imagine the world in the early 1940s, a time when the air hummed with secrets and every shadow might hold a whisper of war. But this is not a story of battles or explosions. It is a story of cleverness, patience, and a strange, rubbery deception that helped the Allies win the war without firing a single shot. In the heart of the conflict, rubber was precious. It was the silent muscle of every army: tires for trucks and jeeps, boots for soldiers, gaskets for engines, and hoses for fuel. Without rubber, the Allies' war machine would grind to a halt. And the Japanese, who controlled the rubber plantations of Southeast Asia, knew this. By 1942, they had cut off nearly all the world's natural rubber supply, leaving the Allies desperate. But the Allies had a secret weapon: their own cleverness. In laboratories across America and Britain, scientists worked day and night to invent a synthetic rubber, a man-made replacement that could keep the trucks rolling and the planes flying. They succeeded, creating a substance called GRS, or government rubber styrene. It worked well enough, but it was not perfect. And the Allies knew the enemy's spies were watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. So they decided to tell a lie, but not a lie shouted from rooftops. A quiet, patient lie planted like a seed in the minds of enemy agents. The plan was simple: make the spies believe that the Allies had discovered a miraculous new source of natural rubber hidden somewhere in the Americas. If the spies thought rubber was abundant, they would stop trying to sabotage production or target supply lines. And the truth, the fragile, hard-won synthetic rubber would be safe. To sell this story, the Allies created a fake rubber plant, not a real factory but a stage. In a remote area of Arizona, they built a convincing imitation, a few buildings, some fake pipes, and a lot of empty barrels. They even gave it a code name, something that sounded important and scientific. They let local workers believe it was real, and they made sure that rumors, carefully whispered, drifted into the ears of known Axis spies. But the most brilliant part of the deception was the product. The Allies produced actual blocks of fake rubber, not the synthetic kind, but a special mixture of wax, clay, and other cheap materials that looked and felt exactly like natural rubber. They stacked these blocks in warehouses, photographed them, and allowed friendly newspaper reporters to write stories about new rubber stockpiles. They even sent samples to neutral countries, where enemy agents could steal them and test them, and find that they seemed to be real rubber. The spies were confused. Their reports back to Berlin and Tokyo told of an Allied rubber surplus, of secret plantations in Brazil or Mexico, of a material that defied the blockade. The enemy's intelligence services wasted months trying to find the source of this phantom rubber. They sent agents to South America, where they searched for hidden plantations that did not exist. They diverted resources from real sabotage missions to chase a ghost. All the while, the Allies' synthetic rubber factories worked quietly, improving their product, training workers, and slowly building a supply that would eventually keep the war effort alive. By 1944, the Allies were producing over 1 million tons of synthetic rubber each year, enough to outlast the enemy's best efforts. The deception had bought them time, and time was the most precious resource of all. And so the fake rubber was never meant to fool the enemy forever. It only needed to fool them long enough. It was a quiet, clever trick, like a bedtime story told to a restless child, something to distract and mislead, while the real work happened in the shadows. The spies never knew they had been deceived by a stage prop and a handful of wax blocks. When the war ended, the truth came out slowly, like a secret finally allowed to rest. The fake rubber plant was dismantled, the blocks melted down, and the story faded into history. But for a few crucial years, a lie made of wax and clay helped save the world from tyranny. And that is a gentle reminder that sometimes the quietest tricks are the most powerful of all. So as you drift towards sleep, remember this. Even in the darkest times, there is room for cleverness, patience, and a little bit of make-believe. The Allies won not only with guns and tanks, but with stories that confused, delayed, and ultimately defeated the enemy. And now, that story is yours to carry into your dreams. Imagine, if you will, a world of steel and silence deep beneath the cold gray waves of the Atlantic. It is the early 1940s, and a submarine glides through the darkness, its crew a tight-knit family of men living in a cramped, humming world of gauges and valves. And at the heart of this metal sanctuary, there is a small, soft creature, a cat. Her name is Marmalade, a ginger tabby with eyes the color of sea glass. She belongs to the submarine's commander, a man known for his steady hand and quiet voice, but who, in the privacy of his tiny cabin, speaks to her in a gentle murmur, as if sharing secrets with the sea itself. Marmalade's life is one of hidden rhythms. She knows the submarine's heartbeat before any man does, the low thrum of the diesel engines when they surface, the almost imperceptible shift to electric motors when they dive. At night, while the crew sleeps in bunks stacked like drawers, she pads silently along the narrow passageways, her whiskers brushing against pipes that carry the ocean's cold. She has her own map of the boat, a mental chart of warm spots near the galley, the quiet coil of rope in the storage locker, and the commander's lap, which is always the best place for a nap. She does not understand the war, only the constant motion of the boat, the smells of oil and salt, and the deep, reassuring rumble of the commander's voice when he reads aloud from a worn book of poems. During the long, uneventful patrols, Marmalade becomes a tiny ambassador of peace. The men, who are often tense and weary, find comfort in her presence. A young radio man once said that watching her chase a dust mote in the dim light of the control room made him forget, for a moment, the depth charges that sometimes echoed in the distance. She is a living reminder of home, of hearths and gardens, of a world above the waves where the sun still shines. She does not fear the cramped spaces or the stale air. She has never known anything else. To her, the submarine is the whole world, and the crew are her family. She purrs when the commander gently strokes her fur, and that purr travels through the metal hull like a quiet song, a note of serenity in the vast, silent ocean. One evening, as the submarine lay still on the seabed, waiting out a storm, the commander found Marmalade curled up on the periscope's eyepiece, her paws tucked under her chin. He smiled, a rare, soft expression. He thought of the strange life she led, a creature of comfort and warmth, surrounded by the cold and the dark. She never asked for anything more than a bit of fish from the galley and a spot to sleep. And yet she gave so much. A steady presence, a gentle warmth, a quiet reminder that even in the depths of war, there is still room for tenderness. The crew, too, found themselves speaking to her, sharing their fears and hopes in low whispers, as if she could carry them up to the surface on her small, furry shoulders. Eventually, the war ended, and the submarine returned to port. Marmalade stepped onto dry land for the first time in years, blinking in the sunlight. She was a little heavier, a little grayer around the muzzle. The commander took her home to a small cottage by the sea. There she would sit on the windowsill and watch the waves, perhaps remembering the hum of the engines, the scent of the oil, the quiet, steady heart of the boat that had carried her through so many deep, dark miles. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled, she would curl up on the commander's chest and purr, as if telling him that even in the secret life of a submarine commander's cat, there is a love that transcends the depths, a love that is simply there, soft and warm, like a breath of air in a steel world. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world is still and the mind wanders softly, let us think of a different kind of hero, those who fought not with guns or bombs, but with hoses and pumps against the fury of fire. They are the forgotten heroes of the firefighting fleet, and their story is one of quiet courage and steady resolve. In the great ports of the Second World War, London, New York, San Francisco, and many others, the waters were busy with ships of war and supply, but among them smaller vessels moved with a purpose all their own. These were the fireboats, sturdy and unglamorous, painted in muted grays and greens. They did not carry cannons or depth charges. Instead, they carried powerful pumps, long hoses, and a crew of men who knew that water could be as mighty as any weapon. Picture the scene, a harbor at dusk, the sky streaked with the last colors of the day. The fireboats rest gently at their docks, their engines humming low. They look like ordinary tugboats, but their decks are crowded with nozzles and ladders. The men aboard are firefighters first, sailors second. They have trained for the worst, but hope for the quietest of days. Then the sirens sound. In the distance, a plume of smoke rises from a burning cargo ship, struck by a bomb or a torpedo. The fireboats cast off, their engines deepening into a steady roar. They glide through the water, pushing aside oil slicks and debris, heading toward the inferno. This is no battle of speed or violence. It is a battle of patience and endurance. The fireboat crew works in unison, one man adjusting the pressure, another aiming the hose, a third relaying orders from the captain. The water arcs high, a silver stream that meets the orange flames, hissing and steaming. The heat is immense, but the men stay calm. They know their ship, their equipment, and each other. Perhaps the most famous of these vessels was the John J. Harvey, a New York City fireboat that served during the war. She and her sisters were called to countless fires along the waterfront and on ships in the harbor. They worked through the night, their lights flickering against the smoke, their crews relieved only when the fire was out or the ship was lost. But the forgotten heroes are not just the boats, they are the men. Many were older, too old to serve in the military, or had essential skills that kept them at home. They worked long shifts, often without recognition. They saw the destruction of war up close, the twisted metal and the charred remains, yet they continued. They did not seek glory. They simply did their duty, standing on wet decks, gripping hoses that vibrated with the force of the water. There is a particular story that whispers through the archives. In the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, fireboats from Honolulu and from the Navy rushed to the burning battleships. They fought fires for days, their pumps straining, the water turning black with oil and soot. They saved many ships from total destruction, though they are rarely mentioned in the history books. Their work was quiet, necessary, and brave. And so, as you drift towards sleep, think of these vessels and their crews. Imagine the gentle rocking of the fireboat at anchor, the soft lap of water against the hull, the distant echo of a whistle. They are not forgotten in the heart of the night, where the past lives on in gentle memory. Their legacy is not in medals or monuments, but in the safety of every port that still stands today. Let your breathing slow, like the rhythm of the pumps, steady and calm. The fireboats have done their work, the fires are out, the harbor is quiet once more, and you can rest, knowing that even in the darkest times, there were quiet heroes who kept the flames at bay. Good night. In the quiet streets of Paris, before the war, there was a piano teacher named Elise. Her life was a gentle rhythm of scales and arpeggios, of students coming and going, their fingers dancing over ivory keys in a sunlit room. She lived in a small apartment near the Luxembourg Gardens, where the sound of her piano often drifted through open windows, mingling with the scent of fresh bread and the distant laughter of children. Elise was a woman of calm habits, her days marked by the soft thud of a metronome and the rustle of sheet music. She knew her students by their hesitant first notes, their small triumphs when a difficult passage finally flowed. This was her world, a world of harmony, of careful instruction, of quiet beauty. But the war came like a crack in a mirror. First, the rumors, then the grey uniforms in the streets, then the silence that fell over the city like a heavy curtain. Elise watched from her window as the familiar landmarks of Paris took on a new, somber character. The Nazis took over buildings, posted notices, and the air grew thick with fear. Yet Elise continued to teach, because what else could she do? The piano still stood in her parlor, the keys still waiting. Her students came less often, their parents worried, but music was a small refuge. One afternoon, a former student returned. He was older now, his face lined with something Elise could not name. He asked to speak with her privately. In the quiet of her studio, he revealed that he was part of the resistance. He needed a place to hold secret meetings, a place that would seem ordinary, innocent. A piano teacher's home, with its constant flow of students and its natural sound of music, was perfect. Elise listened, her hands resting on the cool keys. She could have said no. She could have closed her door and pretended the war was a distant storm. But she thought of her students, of the France she loved, of the small ways she could fight back without a weapon. She agreed. And so quietly, Elise became a spy, not the kind in thrilling films, but a spy of the everyday. She hid messages inside rolled sheets of music, coded in the margins of etudes. She learned to recognize the soft knock of a friend, the slight hesitation in a stranger's step. Her apartment became a waypoint for whispered information, for maps folded into the spine of a book. All the while, she continued to teach. A child would play a sonata, and in the next room, a courier would pass a note. The piano was her cover, its sound masking the rustle of paper, the murmur of secret words. There were close calls. A German officer once stopped by, asking about the music he heard. Elise smiled, offered to play something. She sat at the piano and began a gentle Chopin nocturne, her fingers moving with practiced ease. The officer listened, nodded, and left. Under the sheet music on the stand lay a list of safe houses. After he was gone, Elise slipped it into her apron pocket and continued the lesson as if nothing had happened. Her heart beat faster, but her hands remained steady. Months passed, the war wore on, and Paris grew colder, hungrier. Elise's apartment became a place of quiet courage. She never carried a gun, never fought in the streets. Her war was fought in whispers, in hidden compartments, in the careful selection of which student to trust. She used her knowledge of people, the way a child's fingers hesitated on a difficult chord, the way a parent's eyes darted when they asked about lessons, to sense who was safe and who was not. The resistance relied on her calm, her ability to seem utterly ordinary. She was the piano teacher who never stopped teaching, even as the world around her crumbled. After the liberation, Elise returned to her quiet life. She never spoke much about what she had done. Her students came back, new ones began. The piano remained, its keys worn from years of use. But those who knew her story understood that sometimes the most heroic acts are the ones that leave no mark, that are hidden in the spaces between notes. Elise, the piano teacher, had become a spy not for glory, but for the simple, profound belief that even in the darkest times, a gentle hand can help guide the way. And in the silence of her studio, the music played on, a testament to a courage that asked for nothing in return. In the vast, sun-baked desert of North Africa during World War II, where the sand stretched endlessly under a pale blue sky, a most unusual soldier found his way into the ranks of the Australian 9th Division. It was a young red kangaroo, barely more than a joey, discovered by a group of soldiers near the ruins of a small village. His mother had been lost in the chaos of battle, and the men, with their soft hearts beneath their dusty uniforms, took him in. They named him Skippy at first, but soon he earned a proper title, Private Kangaroo, later promoted to Sergeant, for his calm and steady presence among the troops. This is the story of the war's only kangaroo soldier, a gentle creature who brought a touch of home to the harsh front lines. Sergeant Kangaroo, as he was affectionately called, grew quickly in the care of the soldiers. He was fed on condensed milk from army rations and given a small bed made of sandbags. His fur was a rich reddish-brown, and his eyes held a soft, curious gaze. He would hop around the camp, his long tail swishing behind him, tracing patterns in the sand. The soldiers marveled at his quiet dignity. He never seemed startled by the rumble of trucks or the distant crack of gunfire. Instead, he would stand tall, ears twitching, observing the world with a calm that seemed to soothe the men around him. His presence became a reminder of the Australian outback, of wide-open plains and gentle breezes, far from the dust and noise of war. One of the most endearing stories told about Sergeant Kangaroo involved his daily routine. Each morning, he would hop to the cook tent, where he waited patiently for his share of breakfast. The cooks would save him a handful of oats or a piece of hardtack, which he would nibble with careful precision. Then he would join the soldiers on their morning parade, standing at attention beside the flagpole. He had been taught to salute by raising one paw to his head, though his version was more of a gentle tap. The commanding officer, amused and proud, officially enlisted him as a member of the battalion. He was given a service number, a long string of digits that the men would recite with a grin, and a small slouch hat was made for him, complete with a rising sun badge. He wore it with such natural grace that it seemed he had always been a soldier. As the months passed, the battalion moved from one desert outpost to another. Sergeant Kangaroo traveled with them, often riding in a jeep or perched on the back of a supply truck. He would watch the dunes roll by, his ears flattened against the wind. The men found comfort in his steady presence. In the quiet evenings, when the sun set in shades of orange and purple, they would gather around and tell stories of home. The kangaroo would hop among them, nuzzling a hand here, resting his head on a knee there. He seemed to understand that these were the moments of peace, and he guarded them with his silent, gentle watchfulness. But the war did not spare even this gentle soul from its dangers. During one fierce skirmish, a stray shell exploded near the camp. The kangaroo was struck by a small piece of shrapnel, a wound that left him limping for a time. The soldiers, with great care, bandaged his leg and tended to him as if he were one of their own. He recovered, and from that day, the men swore he stood even taller, as if he had earned his sergeant's stripes through courage. He never flinched again, no matter how close the explosions came. His calmness became a legend, and stories of the kangaroo soldier spread through the Allied forces. Soldiers from other units would visit just to see him, to offer a carrot or a pat on the head. He accepted all with the same quiet dignity. When the war in North Africa ended, the battalion was sent to other theaters, but Sergeant Kangaroo could not follow. He was too beloved to be left behind, and so arrangements were made to send him home to Australia. He traveled by ship, crossing the blue waters of the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, arriving at last in Sydney. He was placed in a small zoo where he lived out his days in peace, visited by the very soldiers who had once fought beside him. They would come in their uniforms, still dusty from the years, and sit by his enclosure, talking softly. He would hop over, press his nose against the fence, and gaze at them with those same calm, knowing eyes. And so the story of the war's only kangaroo soldier became a soft, enduring memory, a tale of gentle companionship in a time of great upheaval, a reminder that even in the harshest of deserts, kindness can take root and grow. Imagine a quiet room, the kind you might find in a small English cottage or a city flat during the long years of the Second World War. The fire crackles softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A woman sits in a worn armchair, her hands moving with a rhythm that is both ancient and new. In her fingers, 2 needles click together and a ball of wool slowly unwinds. She is knitting, but this is no ordinary pastime. This is a secret language, a whispered code stitched into every row of yarn. You see, during the war, knitting became a form of resistance, a quiet act of defiance that was as vital as any battle. The government urged everyone to knit for the troops: socks, scarves, balaclavas, and mittens. Patterns were printed in newspapers and magazines, simple instructions for warm clothing. But beneath the surface of these seemingly innocent projects, a hidden world of signals and messages was being woven. Consider the humble sock. A soldier might receive a pair from a stranger, and in the way the heel was turned, or in the color of the wool, there could be a clue. Knitters were encouraged to use specific colors to indicate different regiments or even to mark safe houses along escape routes. A blue stripe might mean a clear path, while a red one could warn of danger. The very act of knitting became a map, a coded message that only those in the know could read. Then there were the patterns themselves. A seemingly simple cable stitch could hide a number, a sequence that matched a specific date or a rendezvous point. The tension of the yarn, the number of stitches in a row, the way a pattern repeated, all of these could be signs. Knitters would gather in quiet circles, their needles clicking in unison, and they would share these secrets not with words, but with the work in their hands. It was a sisterhood of silence, a bond that transcended the ordinary. One of the most famous examples is the sweater code used by the French resistance. Knitters would create sweaters with intricate patterns that looked like traditional Fair Isle or Aran designs. But each pattern held a hidden meaning. A diamond might signify a meeting, a zigzag could indicate a change in plans, and a cluster of dots might be a warning to stay away. These sweaters were passed from hand to hand, worn by agents and couriers, and the messages they carried were never written down, only remembered and knitted. And let us not forget the simple act of unraveling. A knitter might receive a ball of wool from a friend, and as she worked, she would discover a tiny note hidden inside, or a thread of a different color that spelled out a name. The yarn itself became a vessel for hope, for love, for the promise of a future where the war would be just a memory. As the war went on, knitting became a form of therapy, a way to channel anxiety into something useful. Women knitted while they waited for news from the front, while they listened to the radio, while they tended to their gardens. The steady rhythm of the needles was a lullaby, a heartbeat that kept them connected to their loved ones far away. And in the darkness of the blackout, with the windows covered and the world outside held in a strange silence, the click of needles was a sound of resilience. Today we might look at a vintage knitted scarf and see only a beautiful piece of craft. But if you look closer, if you imagine the hands that made it, the stories they carried, the secrets they kept, you might just hear the whispers of a time when a simple stitch could change the world. So as you drift towards sleep, let the image of those gentle hands and the soft wool soothe you, and know that even in the quietest moments there is strength, there is courage, and there is a hidden code waiting to be remembered. Imagine, if you will, a time when the world was at war and the greatest minds were dreaming of impossible things. It was the early 1940s, and the Allies were desperate for a way to protect their convoys across the cold Atlantic. The German U-boats were a constant threat, sinking supply ships faster than they could be replaced. The solution, it seemed, might come from the most unlikely of materials: ice. You see, a man named Geoffrey Pike, a brilliant and eccentric inventor, had an idea. He suggested building an aircraft carrier not from steel, but from frozen water. It sounds like something from a fairy tale, doesn't it? A ship made of ice, strong enough to land planes, slow enough to drift like a patient iceberg. Pike believed that if you mixed wood pulp with ice, you could create a material far stronger than ordinary ice, resistant to melting and even bulletproof. They called it picrete. So the Allies began to test this strange substance. In secret laboratories, they froze blocks of picrete and shot bullets at them. They saw that the ice held, the wood fibers binding it together like a frozen puzzle. They built a small prototype on a lake in Canada, a model of the proposed vessel, just to see if it would float. And it did. It floated beautifully, a silent, white arc on the still water. The plan was audacious. A massive ship, 2,000 feet long, with walls 30 feet thick, powered by enormous engines that would churn through the sea at a gentle pace. It would carry hundreds of aircraft, a floating airfield that could be used to hunt U-boats or support invasions. They called it Project Habakkuk, after a biblical prophet who spoke of wonders in the land. But as with many dreams, reality began to creep in. The ship would require an immense amount of ice, and the refrigeration systems to keep it frozen would be colossal. The cost, in both materials and manpower, was staggering. And then there was the problem of speed. The ice carrier would be slow, a lumbering giant that any U-boat could easily avoid. The generals and admirals began to have doubts. Still, the tests continued. Engineers worked on ways to reinforce the picrete, to insulate it from the warm waters of the Atlantic. They considered using it for floating docks or temporary runways. But the war was changing. New longer-range aircraft and escort carriers made the ice ship less necessary. The urgent need faded like morning mist. And so the project was quietly abandoned. The prototype on the lake was left to melt, its icy hull returning to the water from which it came. No giant ice carrier ever sailed the ocean. But the story remains, a testament to human creativity and the desperate ingenuity of war. It reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary ideas are born from the simplest materials, and that even the most solid plans can melt away, leaving only a whisper of what might have been. So as you drift off to sleep, think of that frozen ship, a ghostly vessel that never was, floating in a calm, endless sea, a dream of ice, silent and still, under a moonlit sky. Good night. Imagine, if you will, a quiet room in a modest building, somewhere far from the roar of battle. It is the early 1940s, and the world is at war. But here, there are no gunshots, no explosions, only the soft hum of machinery and the scratch of pens on paper. This is the story of a different kind of courage, the quiet, patient courage of the men who mapped the ocean floor. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were scientists, cartographers, and engineers. They wore lab coats more often than uniforms. Their weapons were not rifles, but echo sounders and plotting boards. Their battlefield was the vast, dark, and largely unknown abyss of the world's oceans. You see, at the start of the war, our knowledge of the seafloor was embarrassingly poor. Imagine trying to navigate a dark room by memory, only to realize you have no idea where the furniture is. That was the situation for the navies. Submarines and ships needed to move silently and secretly, but they were blind to the mountains and valleys hidden beneath the waves. A submarine could be crushed by an undersea peak, or a convoy could be ambushed in a channel no one knew existed. And so a quiet mission began. It was called Project H, or sometimes just the Sounding Project. Men were sent out on research vessels, disguised as ordinary ships. Their job was simple in concept, but incredibly difficult in practice. They would sail back and forth across the ocean, sending out sound pulses and listening for the echoes. Each echo told them how deep the water was. One measurement at a time, they built a picture of the invisible world below. Picture a cold morning in the North Atlantic. A ship, the *US Stuart or the RV Atlantis, cuts through grey, choppy water. Inside a small, cramped cabin, a man in a wool sweater sits hunched over a machine. He wears headphones, listening carefully. A stylus scratches across a slowly rotating drum of paper. Each time a sound returns, the stylus makes a small mark. He marks the time, the location, the depth. He does this for hours, day after day, week after week. The work is monotonous. The weather is often foul. But he knows that each mark is a small piece of a puzzle that could save lives. There is a particular story about a man named Harry Hess. He was a geologist, but during the war he became a captain of a transport ship. Even as he carried troops and supplies across the Pacific, he never stopped his work. Between watches, he would turn on the ship's echo sounder, letting it run continuously. He collected thousands of miles of depth recordings. He was not fighting the enemy, he was fighting ignorance. And in doing so, he discovered something extraordinary. The ocean floor was not a flat, muddy plain. It was a landscape of dramatic mountains, deep trenches, and flat-topped seamounts he called geos. These discoveries were made in the quietest of ways. There was no fanfare. No medals were pinned on chests for finding a new undersea mountain. The work was slow, deliberate, and often thankless, but it was vital. The maps they created allowed submarines to hide in deep trenches, let supply ships find safe routes, and helped plan the great invasions of the war. The success of the D-Day landings, for instance, depended on knowing the exact shape of the English Channel floor. So as you drift towards sleep, think of these quiet heroes. They were not charging up a beach. They were not in the air. They were below in the depths, listening to the heartbeat of the earth. They faced a different kind of fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of being wrong, the fear that their work might not matter. But they persisted. They gathered their data, plotted their points, and slowly, patiently revealed the hidden geography of our planet. Their courage was the courage to be still, to be precise, and to believe that knowledge itself was a weapon. They mapped the darkness so that others could find their way home. In the quiet, forested hills of southwestern Poland, there lies a mystery that has drifted through the decades like a half-remembered dream. It is the story of a train that may never have existed, yet has captured the imagination of treasure hunters, historians, and dreamers around the world. This is the strange tale of the Nazi gold train of WWII. Let us travel back to the final months of World War II in the cold winter of 1945. The German army was retreating from the advancing Soviet forces, and the Nazis were desperate to hide their plundered treasures. They had gathered gold, jewels, artwork, and even secret documents from across occupied Europe. Some of it was stored in bank vaults, some in castle cellars, and some, it was said, was loaded onto a special armored train somewhere in the region of Lower Silesia, now part of Poland. The train was reportedly a long, heavy locomotive pulling several sealed carriages, guarded by SS soldiers. Its destination was the sprawling system of underground tunnels and bunkers known as Project Reese, or Giant, built by the Nazis in the Owl Mountains. These tunnels were meant to be a secret headquarters, but they were never finished. As the war drew to a close, the train supposedly rolled into a tunnel near the town of WWII and then vanished. Some say the tunnel was deliberately collapsed behind it, sealing the train and its cargo forever in a tomb of stone and earth. For decades after the war, the story was passed along in whispers. Locals spoke of strange lights in the forest, of ground that seemed to hum with a hidden energy, of old maps that showed a railway line leading into a hillside, but going nowhere. Treasure hunters came with shovels and metal detectors, but they found nothing. The Polish government dismissed the legend as a fantasy, a fairy tale spun from the ashes of war. Then, in the summer of 2015, the story burst back to life. Two men, a German and a Pole, claimed to have found the train using ground-penetrating radar. They said it was buried deep in a tunnel near the 65th kilometer of the Wrocław-Wołbrzych railway line. The news spread like wildfire. The world watched as the Polish military and geologists moved in, drilling boreholes and scanning the ground. Cameras rolled, and a sense of hushed anticipation filled the air. But the excavation found nothing. No train, no gold, no tunnel. The radar images were later explained as natural ice formations or old geological features. The treasure hunters were ridiculed, and the legend retreated once more into the shadows. Yet the mystery did not die. Even today, some believe that the train is still there, hidden deeper than the probes could reach, or that it was secretly removed long ago. Others think the story was a deliberate Nazi hoax, a piece of misdirection to confuse the Allies. What is certain is that the Owl Mountains hold many secrets. The unfinished tunnels of Project WWII still yawn open in the hillsides, dark and cold. They are a monument to a terrible time, a reminder of the extremes of human ambition and cruelty. The gold train, whether real or imagined, has become a symbol of that lost chapter, a treasure that may never be found, but will always be sought. So as you drift towards sleep, picture the quiet forests of Poland, with their misty mornings and the rustle of leaves. Imagine a railway track, overgrown with moss, vanishing into a hillside. Somewhere deep underground, there might be a train, still and silent, waiting for a moment that will never come. Or perhaps it is only a story, a gentle ghost of history, content to remain a mystery forever. And in that mystery, there is a kind of peace, a reminder that not all riddles need to be solved, and that some treasures are best left to the imagination. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with quiet, forgotten places. In the quiet hours of a winter evening in 1944, far from the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire, a single game of chess was about to shift the course of a battle. It was not a game played on a board of wood and ivory, but in the mind of a man who understood that war, like chess, is a dance of patience and foresight. The setting was a small, dimly lit command post in the Ardennes forest, where the air smelled of wet earth and cold metal, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of a map being folded. The man, a young American intelligence officer named Captain John, had been studying the German positions for days, feeling the weight of 1,000 lives pressing down on his shoulders. He knew the enemy was planning an attack, but the timing and direction were as hidden as the moon behind the clouds. In the quiet of a world at war, there is a story of hands that worked without glory, hands that shaped the very instruments of freedom, yet were never named in the histories. This is the story of the women who built the bombers in silence. Imagine a vast factory floor, not in a bustling city, but on the outskirts of a small American town, where the air smells of metal shavings and fresh paint. The year is 1943. The sun rises slowly, casting long, soft shadows through the high windows of the assembly plant. Inside, the hum of machinery is a steady, gentle rhythm, like a lullaby for the nation at work. These women, Rosie the Riveter's forgotten sisters, arrive before dawn, their hair wrapped in bandanas, their hands calloused but sure. They were secretaries, teachers, waitresses, and mothers before the war called them to a different kind of service. Now they stand at long tables, surrounded by blueprints that look like abstract art to the uninitiated, but to them, they are maps of a sacred duty. There is a woman named Elena, a former seamstress from a small farm in Iowa. Her fingers, once accustomed to threading needles through cotton, now guide rivets into the wings of B-17 flying fortresses. She works with a gentle precision, each tap of her rivet gun a soft, metallic heartbeat. She does not think of the bombs her plane will carry. She thinks only of the young men who will fly it, and of her own son, who is somewhere across the ocean, writing letters she reads by lamplight. Beside her, a young woman named Clara, a recent high school graduate with a shy smile, checks the wiring in the bomber's nose. She learned her craft in a 6-week course, a crash education in the art of war. She works slowly, deliberately, ensuring every connection is perfect. She imagines the pilot, a faceless stranger she will never meet, and she whispers a quiet prayer for him as she tightens a bolt. The work is repetitive, but it is also meditative, a gentle, rhythmic dance of hand and tool. The women work in shifts, the factory never falling silent. The night shift is a world of shadows and the soft glow of work lights. Here, the sound of rivet guns and drills becomes a kind of ambient music, a steady, soothing hum. The women chat quietly, their voices low, sharing stories of home, of letters from husbands and brothers overseas, of the ration books and the victory gardens that sustain them. They laugh softly, a sound that floats above the machinery, a reminder that even in the midst of a world at war, there is still tenderness, still humanity. But the work is not just about the bombers. It is about the silence they build into each plane, the silence of the women who will never fly in them, the silence of their own names, which will be forgotten when the war ends. They do not seek fame. They do not expect parades. They know that the bombers they build will be remembered, but not the hands that made them. And yet they continue day after day because the work is a form of love, a way to care for the world they hope to leave for their children. As the months pass, the women become a family. They celebrate birthdays with slices of rationed cake. They comfort each other when the telegrams arrive with news from the front. They hold each other in the quiet moments after a shift ends. The factory is not just a place of work. It is a sanctuary, a place where they can be strong and vulnerable at the same time. The bombers they build are not just machines. They are vessels of hope, carrying the dreams of a nation. When the war finally ends, the women will pack up their tools and return to their homes. The factories will fall silent, the machinery will be sold for scrap, and the women will be expected to resume their old lives as if nothing had happened. But they carry with them a quiet pride, a secret knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves. They built the bombers that ended the war, and they did it in silence, with hands that were gentle but strong. And so, as you drift towards sleep, remember the forgotten women who worked through the night, their fingers tracing the shape of history. Their story is a lullaby of quiet heroism, a reminder that the most profound acts of strength are often the ones that make no sound at all. Let the hum of their labor and the soft rhythm of their work carry you gently into a peaceful rest. It was a cold winter's night in the Ardennes forest, in the final year of the Great War. The snow had fallen softly for hours, muffling the world in a deep, quiet white. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of artillery could be heard, but it seemed far away, like a distant thunder that no longer threatened. Two young soldiers, one American, one German, found themselves alone in a small farmhouse, each seeking shelter from the biting wind. They had entered from opposite sides, unaware of the other's presence, until they stood face to face in the dim light of a dying fire. For a long moment, neither moved. The American, a boy from a small town in Ohio, clutched his rifle, but his hands were trembling from cold, not fear. The German, a farmer's son from Bavaria, held his own weapon loosely, as if he had forgotten he carried it. The only sound was the crackling of embers and the soft hiss of melting snow on the roof. They stared at each other, and in that silence something shifted. The war, with its orders and hatreds, seemed to fade into the grey fog outside. The German spoke first, his voice low and hesitant. "Es ist kalt," he said, and then in broken English, "It is cold." The American nodded, lowering his rifle. "Yeah," he whispered, "freezing." He gestured toward the fire, and the German understood. They both laid down their weapons by the door, an unspoken agreement, and sat down on opposite sides of the hearth. The fire had almost gone out, but the American found a few more logs stacked in the corner. He fed them into the flames, and soon a warm glow filled the room. They did not speak much, for their languages were different, but they shared what they had. The German pulled a piece of hard bread from his coat and offered half to the American. The American, in turn, produced a small tin of coffee. They brewed it in a dented pot they found on the stove, and the rich aroma mixed with the smell of wood smoke. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the scars of the battlefield. Inside, the two soldiers sat in quiet companionship, each lost in memories of home. The American thought of his mother's kitchen, of the smell of fresh bread, and the sound of his little sister laughing. The German thought of his father's farm, of the cows lowing in the barn, and the warm milk they would drink in the morning. They were not enemies now, just two tired young men, far from the lives they had known. The fire crackled softly, and the wind moaned outside, but the room was safe, a small pocket of peace in a world at war. As the night deepened, they fell asleep, each curled up on opposite sides of the hearth. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. When dawn came gray and cold, they woke to find that the snow had stopped. The war was still there, waiting for them, but for a few hours they had been something else. Simply two human beings, sharing warmth and a moment of stillness. They gathered their weapons, nodded to each other, and went their separate ways into the frosty morning. Neither ever spoke of that night, but both carried it with them, a secret memory of a time when the world was quiet and the only enemy was the cold. And so, the coincidence of two soldiers meeting on opposite sides became a story of kindness, not conflict. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, the simplest acts of humanity can shine through, like a single candle in a vast, frozen night. As you drift off to sleep, remember that peace is always possible, even in the most unexpected places. Let the image of that quiet farmhouse, with its soft fire and two sleeping soldiers, be a gentle lullaby for your mind. In the quiet hills of southern France, during the darkest days of the Second World War, there was a cave that did not just hide soldiers or store weapons, it held a voice. A voice that whispered hope into the ears of those who had almost forgotten how to listen. This is the story of Radio Londres, or rather, a secret sister station that never officially existed, known only as Radio Cave. It began in the autumn of 1942, when the Nazi occupation had settled like a heavy fog over Europe. In the small village of St. Martin-Vesubie, high in the Alps, a group of resistance fighters discovered a deep limestone cave hidden behind a waterfall. The cave was dry, with a natural acoustics that made sound travel in strange, soft echoes. They brought in a small transmitter, barely powerful enough to reach a few valleys, but it was enough. Every night just before midnight, a woman named Ilara would climb into the cave. She was not a trained broadcaster. She had been a schoolteacher before the war, teaching children to read poems about spring and kindness. Now she sat on a cold stone, her voice steady and low, reading letters from prisoners of war, messages from families separated by borders, and sometimes just a story about a star she had seen through the cave's opening. Her voice was not loud, but it carried, like a lullaby through the static. The broadcasts were never announced. There was no fanfare, no dramatic music, just a soft crackle and then her voice. Good evening, this is the voice from the cave. Tonight we have a letter from a father in Lyon who wants his daughter to know that he is thinking of her. He says, the chestnut tree in our garden is still there. I saw it in a dream. Listeners would huddle around hidden radios, turning the dial with trembling fingers. They did not tell their neighbors. It was a secret they held close, like a warm stone in a cold pocket. The broadcasts were short, never more than 15 minutes, because the Nazis had direction-finding equipment. But in those minutes, the war seemed to pause. The cave became a sanctuary not of stone, but of sound. One night, a young soldier, hiding in a barn, heard Ilara's voice for the first time. He had been alone for weeks, moving from safe house to safe house. He had forgotten what a gentle voice sounded like. When she said, remember, even in the longest night, the stars are still there, he wept. Not from sorrow, but from the sudden, aching realization that he was not forgotten. The secret radio station operated for 18 months. It was never captured, never traced. The cave's entrance was hidden by a curtain of water, and the villagers kept silent. When the war ended, Ilara returned to teaching. She never spoke of the broadcasts, but decades later, a historian found a diary of a resistance fighter who had written, the cave radio was not a weapon, it was a promise that kindness could travel through stone and shadow. Today the cave is quiet. The waterfall still falls, and the limestone walls still hold the softest of echoes. But if you listen very carefully, on a still night, some say you can hear a faint voice reading a poem about spring. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, we can create light, not with fire, but with words, spoken softly from a secret place. Imagine a quiet morning in the English countryside, not long after the sun has risen. The dew is still clinging to the grass, and the air smells of damp earth and wild thyme. From a distance, a cluster of cottages comes into view, with thin wisps of smoke curling from their chimneys. Chickens scratch in a dusty yard, and a farmer in a flat cap leans against a gate. It looks like any ordinary little village, the kind that has stood for centuries. But if you were to walk closer, you'd notice something strange. The chickens are made of wood. The farmer never moves. The chimneys smoke only when a hidden crew pulls a lever. This was no real village. It was a stage, a carefully crafted illusion built by the Allies to deceive the eyes in the sky. In the quiet between battles, when the guns fell silent and the smoke drifted away in the cool air, there lived a dog who would become the most decorated of the war. His name was Chips, a shepherd collie mix with warm amber eyes and ears that perked at the slightest rustle of a letter from home. He belonged to a soldier named John Rowell, and together they trained for months in the forests of North Carolina, learning the language of trust that needs no words. Chips was not bred for war. He was a family dog, gentle with children, fond of curling up by the fire. But when the world grew loud and uncertain, he answered a different call. The army needed dogs, loyal, clever dogs, to guard, to scout, to offer comfort in an unforgiving landscape. Chips stepped forward, his tail wagging softly as if to say, "I will go where you go." They shipped across the ocean, the great grey ships cutting through waves that seemed endless. John would sit with Chips on the deck at dusk, the sky awash of pink and violet, and they would watch the stars appear. The dog's head rested on his knee, a warm anchor in a world adrift. "Just a little longer," John would whisper, and Chips would thump his tail twice, understanding. The first real test came on a quiet beach in Sicily. The air smelled of salt and distant smoke, and the sand was still warm from the day's sun. Chips had learned to warn of danger with a low, rumbling growl, his only weapon apart from an honest heart. That night, as shadows moved between the dunes, he stiffened. But instead of barking, he pressed close to John's leg, a silent signal. They took cover, and when the danger passed, Chips licked John's hand, as if to say, "All is well now." Word of Chips spread from tent to tent, from soldier to soldier. He became a quiet hero, not for violence, but for his steadfast calm. During one particularly tense patrol, he trotted ahead, nose to the ground, and stopped at a narrow path. John knew what that meant, a minefield. He called the men back, and they circled wide, safe because one small dog had paid attention to the Earth's hidden warnings. There was a medal, of course, several in fact, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, but Chips never wore them with pride. He preferred a scratched leather collar and the gentle hand of his soldier. When John pinned the cloth star on his harness, Chips simply yawned and rested his head on his paws. The ceremony happened in a quiet clearing, with sunlight filtering through olive trees, the only sound a creek murmuring nearby. As the war wore on, Chips grew older, grayer around the muzzle. He had seen too much and smelled too much, but his eyes remained soft. John would sometimes catch him staring at the horizon, as if remembering a home he had left behind, a green backyard, a child's laughter, a hearth that never went cold. But then John would call his name, and Chips would trot back, tail high, ready for whatever came next. When peace finally settled like a quiet snow, Chips returned with John to the small white house with the picket fence. The neighbors came to see the famous dog, but Chips was more interested in the bone buried under the rose bush. He slept on the porch in the afternoon sun, his paws twitching as he chased dreams of open fields and no more alarms. And so Chips lived out his days in gentle obscurity, the most decorated dog of the war, yet never once boasting of his deeds. The medals went into a drawer, the stories into the hearts of those who knew him. On quiet nights, when the wind carries the scent of distant rain, you might still hear the soft thump of a tail, patient and kind, reminding us that courage often wears the simplest of faces. Now as you rest, imagine that same gentle peace descending over the world, a moment when all is still, and the only sound is the slow breathing of a loyal friend dreaming of home. There is a small village in the south of France, nestled between gentle hills and the soft murmur of a river. Its name, St. Julian, is written in faded letters above the door of the old stone church. For generations, the villagers had lived a quiet life, their days measured not by watches, but by the sun, the seasons, and the deep, steady chime of the church bell. But that bell fell silent in the spring of 1940 when the clockwork inside the tower finally gave way. The hands of the clock stopped at 3:27, and no one in the village had the heart or the tools to fix it. They simply let it be, a frozen moment in the middle of the afternoon, as if time itself had decided to pause. Years passed and the war came closer. Soldiers in grey uniforms marched through the square, their boots echoing against the cobblestones. The villagers learned to keep their heads down, to speak in whispers, and to hide their fear behind polite smiles. Yet the clock remained still, a silent witness to everything. The old clockmaker, Monsieur Dubois, would sometimes gaze up at the tower and shake his head. "It's broken beyond repair," he would say softly, "but perhaps it still knows something we don't." In the summer of 1944, a German unit was stationed in the village. Their commander, a weary man named Hauptmann Richter, had seen too much war. He was not cruel, but he was strict, and he had orders to maintain control. One afternoon, a young resistance fighter was captured just outside the village. The Hauptmann was told that the villagers must have helped him and that a reprisal was necessary, a punishment strike at dawn, before the Allies could advance any further. The order was given. At 4:00 in the morning, the village would be evacuated and then destroyed. The soldiers were to assemble in the square at 3:30, ready to move. That night the village lay in darkness. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. In the church tower, the broken clock still showed 3:27. The hands had not moved in 4 years. No one gave it a second thought. But as the night wore on, a strange thing happened. The young soldier assigned to wake the garrison glanced at his own watch. It was a cheap, unreliable thing, and saw it was nearly 3:30. He hurried to the commander's quarters. "Herr Hauptmann, it is time," he whispered. Richter nodded, pulled on his coat, and stepped into the square. The moon was bright, casting long shadows. He looked up at the church tower out of habit and saw the clock. It read 3:27. He frowned. "Your watch is fast," he said quietly. "The clock says 3:27. We have 3 more minutes. Wait." The soldier checked his watch again, confused. "But sir, it is 3:30 by my time." Richter shook his head. "The church clock is always right. It has been that way for decades. I trust it. Tell the men to stand easy. We will wait." So they waited, and in those 3 minutes something else happened. A runner arrived from the command post with urgent news. The Allied advance had shifted and the reprisal was cancelled. The village was to be left alone. The order had come in just a few minutes earlier, but the radio operator had been delayed. If the soldiers had already left, the message would have been too late. But because the commander had hesitated, because of a broken clock that showed the wrong time, the village was saved. Dawn came gently over St. Julian. The sun rose through a soft haze and the birds began to sing. The villagers emerged from their homes, unsure of what had happened. They saw the soldiers filing out of the square, their packs heavy, their faces tired. The Hauptmann climbed into his staff car and looked back one last time at the church tower. The clock still said 3:27. He smiled, almost imperceptibly, and then he was gone. Monsieur Dubois never fixed the clock. He said it had done its job, and that some things were better left as they were. To this day, the hands of the clock in St. Julian still point to 3:27. It is a quiet reminder that even in the darkest times, a moment of stillness, a tiny pause, can change everything. The village survived, and the clock remains, gently marking a time that never was, but saved a world that was. Imagine, if you will, a quiet summer evening in the year 1940. The sun is setting over a sleepy village in Central Europe. Church bells toll the hour, and people check their pocket watches, winding them gently before bed. But what if those watches were wrong? What if the very time we measure our days by had been quietly shifted, like a curtain drawn across a window? This is the strange case of the phantom time zone. A curious chapter from the years of the Second World War, when time itself became a weapon, and a secret was hidden in the ticking of clocks. In the early 1940s, as war spread across Europe, the German government implemented a change that seems small at first, just 1 hour. They permanently shifted the clocks forward, creating a permanent daylight saving time. Officially, it was called High Summer Time or Mitteleuropäische Sommerzeit, and it was meant to save fuel and extend working hours. But in occupied countries, this change had a deeper purpose. It was a silent, creeping control over daily life. A farmer in France, a shopkeeper in Poland, a schoolteacher in the Netherlands, they all found their mornings darker, their evenings longer. The sun no longer rose when their bodies expected. The hour of noon no longer marked the sun's highest point. Time had been bent. Historians later discovered something remarkable. This time shift created a kind of phantom zone. For the duration of the war, the clocks in much of Europe were permanently set 1 hour ahead of solar time. This meant that if you stood in Paris or Amsterdam at true midday, when the sun was directly overhead, your wristwatch would show 1 p.m. The natural rhythm of the day was out of sync, and in the occupied territories, this was no accident. It was a way to disrupt resistance, to make people feel disoriented, to subtly remind them that their lives were no longer their own. Every time they checked the time, they were reminded of the new order. But there is another layer to this story. After the war, many countries simply set their clocks back to standard time, yet a few, including Spain and France, kept the change permanently. To this day, watching the sunset at 10 p.m. in Madrid in summer is a ghost of that wartime decision. The phantom time zone lived on long after the war ended. Some say it still lingers, a faint echo in the way Europeans experience daylight. In a quiet way, this tale reminds us that time is not just numbers on a face. It is a story we tell ourselves. And during those dark years, the story was rewritten by those who understood that even the hour of the day could be a tool of power. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, think of the gentle ticking of a clock and of all the secret rhythms that shape our world without us ever knowing. The strange case of the phantom time zone is a soft mystery, a reminder that history hides in the smallest details. And perhaps, in the quiet of your own room, you can feel the echo of that long-ago hour slipping like a shadow across the wall. It was December of 1944, and the world had been at war for 5 long years. The forests of the Ardennes in Belgium and Luxembourg lay under a thick blanket of snow, silent and cold, as if the land itself had fallen into a deep sleep. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with white, and the only sound was the occasional creak of ice or the distant rumble of artillery, a reminder that even in this frozen stillness, the war continued. But in that stillness, something remarkable almost happened, something that might have been remembered as a moment of shared humanity, a brief pause in the madness. It was called the forgotten battle of the Christmas truce that almost was. Picture it, young men from both sides, American and German, huddled in foxholes and dugouts, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. They were cold, hungry, and tired, so very tired of the fear, the noise, the endless waiting. On Christmas Eve, a strange quiet settled over the front lines. The guns fell silent, not because of any order, but because the soldiers themselves seemed to feel the weight of the season. Some whispered that it was the spirit of Christmas, seeping through the frozen ground like a gentle thaw. In one sector, near the small village of WWII-only, a group of American soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division heard something unexpected, the sound of singing. It drifted across the no-man's land, faint at first, then clearer, a German carol, still nacht, Heilige Nacht. The melody was soft and haunting, carried by the wind through the pines. The Americans listened, their hearts aching with a strange mix of longing and hope. One of them, a young private from Ohio, began to hum along. Another joined in, and soon a few voices rose together in English. Silent night, holy night. Singing stopped, and there was a long pause filled only by the whisper of snow. Then from the German lines, a voice called out in broken English, "Hello, Tommy, Merry Christmas." It was a risk, a fragile thread thrown across the darkness. The Americans hesitated, but then a sergeant replied, "Same to you, Fritz. Any coffee over there?" A ripple of laughter, nervous and human, passed through the air. For a few moments, the war seemed like a distant memory, a bad dream from which they were about to wake. What followed was not a grand truce, but a series of small, unofficial gestures, a shared cigarette left on a stump, a can of beef traded for a chocolate bar, a wave between sentries who chose not to shoot. In one area, soldiers from both sides crept out of their trenches to meet in the middle, where the snow was untouched. They exchanged names, showed photographs of sweethearts and children, and even played a brief game of football with a crumpled tin can. The night was cold, but their breath mingled in the air, and for a few hours they were not enemies, just men, far from home, wishing for peace. But this truce was fragile, and it was almost forgotten because it never spread. The higher commanders on both sides were furious when they heard of it. They saw it as a threat to discipline, a dangerous softening of the will to fight. Orders were issued, no fraternization, no singing, no kindness. And so, by the morning of December 26th, the guns roared again, and the snow was stained with red. The men who had shared a moment of peace were forced back into their roles, and the memory of that night faded into the fog of war. Why is it called the Forgotten Battle? Because it was never officially recorded. No medals were given, no songs were written. It lived only in the letters home, the whispered stories told around campfires, and the quiet sorrow of those who had glimpsed a different path. The Ardennes forests still stand today, and if you walk there in winter, when the snow is deep and the world is still, you might almost hear it, the faint echo of a carol carried on the wind, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of kindness can flicker, however briefly, and that hope is never truly lost. That is the story of the Christmas truce that almost was, a gentle whisper in the silence of history. In the quiet of a laboratory, the air hummed with the secrets of radar. A chance discovery changed the way the world would warm its meals. It was the 1940s, and the world was at war. Scientists worked tirelessly, their minds bent on perfecting the magnetron, a device that sent out powerful pulses of microwave energy, invisible to the eye, to detect enemy aircraft through fog and darkness. This was the heart of radar, a technology that helped protect nations and turn the tide of conflict. But in one of those labs, a man named Percy Spencer stood before a magnetron, curious and observant. He was an engineer with a restless mind, someone who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. One day, while testing a new magnetron, he noticed something strange. A candy bar in his pocket had begun to melt. The warmth was gentle, not scorching, just a soft yielding of chocolate to a hidden power. Spencer didn't panic. He was intrigued. He sent for popcorn kernels and placed them near the magnetron. The kernels popped, dancing in the air, filling the room with the familiar smell of a cozy kitchen. Then came an egg, which, in a moment of playful curiosity, exploded, splattering yolk across a colleague's face. Yet in that mess, Spencer saw a vision. He understood that these microwaves, born from the urgent needs of war, could be tamed for peace. The radar research that had once scanned the skies for danger could now warm a loaf of bread or melt butter with a soft, invisible touch. The first microwave oven was a bulky thing, as tall as a refrigerator, plumbed for water to cool its powerful tube. It was called the Radarange, a name that whispered of its origins. Restaurants and institutions were the first to welcome it, marveling at how quickly it could heat a sandwich or a plate of stew. But it would take time, decades of refinement, before this marvel found its way into homes, becoming a gentle companion in the quiet hours of the morning or the drowsy evening. The microwave oven is a story of transformation, a device born from the shadows of conflict, repurposed to bring comfort and ease. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, innovations can emerge that nurture and soothe, turning the echoes of radar into the soft hum that warms our midnight tea. And so, as you drift towards sleep, think of that gentle wave, invisible and kind, carrying a legacy of peace from a time when the world needed hope. The microwave oven is more than a machine. It is a testament to human creativity, a small miracle that began with a melting candy bar and a curious mind. Imagine, if you will, a vast white continent, so cold and silent that it seems to exist outside of time itself, a place of endless ice and wind, where the sun barely rises in winter and never truly sets in summer. This is Antarctica, the most remote and least explored land on Earth. And yet, for a brief, strange moment in history, This frozen wilderness became the focus of one of the most peculiar beliefs to emerge from the chaos of the Second World War. The idea that the Nazis had built a secret base there, hidden beneath the ice. To understand why such a belief took hold, we must journey back to Germany in the 1930s, a nation rebuilding its pride, obsessed with science, conquest, and mysterious myths. The Nazi leadership was fascinated by advanced technology, ancient legends, and the idea of hidden lands. They believed that Germany's destiny lay in exploring the unknown, and Antarctica, blank on many maps, almost untouched, beckoned like a blank canvas. In 1938, a German expedition set sail for Antarctica aboard a ship called the Schwabenland. Their mission was to scout the territory for a potential whaling station, to secure resources for the Reich, and to claim a slice of the continent for Germany. They flew seaplanes over the ice, dropping markers shaped like swastikas, and named the region New Schwabenland, New Swabia. It was a small venture, quickly overshadowed by the war, but it planted a seed. When the war ended in 1945, Germany was in ruins. Hitler was dead, the Nazi leadership scattered. But in the chaos, strange rumors began to circulate, stories that a select group of scientists, soldiers, and even U-boats had escaped to a remote refuge in Antarctica. Some said they had built a base deep within the ice, using advanced technology, flying discs, long-range submarines, and secret energy weapons. Why would they believe this? Because the Nazis had indeed been fascinated with the Antarctic and had invested in bizarre projects. The Thule Society and other occult groups spoke of a hollow Earth and a lost Aryan homeland, perhaps even beneath the ice. After the war, Allied forces discovered that Germany had developed long-range submarines capable of reaching the southern oceans. There were also reports of U-boats surrendering months after the war ended, their crews speaking of a secret base, codenamed Base 211. American intelligence even launched a massive military operation in 1946-47 called Operation Highjump, officially for training, but some believed it was to investigate or destroy this hidden Nazi fortress. The operation's commander, Admiral Richard Byard, later made cryptic remarks about flying objects and a threat from the polar region, fueling the myth. So why did the Nazis themselves believe in a secret Antarctic base? In reality, many Nazi leaders were desperate for a last-ditch sanctuary, a place to regroup and continue the fight. Some were influenced by esoteric ideas of a pure, icy world where the Aryan race could be reborn. Others simply wanted to hide their stolen treasures and scientific research. But the belief was not just a post-war fantasy. It grew from a strange mix of real expeditions, secret projects, and a deep psychological need for a final, untouchable stronghold. Of course, no concrete evidence of such a base has ever been found. The vast ice of Antarctica holds many secrets, but not, as far as we know, a hidden Nazi city. Yet the story endures, a quiet whisper from a time of great turmoil, a myth that refuses to freeze over. It reminds us how, even in the coldest, most desolate places, the human imagination can find a home, and how the echoes of war can linger in the most unlikely corners of the earth. There is a kind of courage that does not war. It does not charge into battle or make the headlines. It is the quiet courage of staying still, of holding a light steady against the darkness, of keeping a promise to a flame while the world outside burns. During the Second World War, along the rocky coasts of Britain, France, and the Baltic, there were men and women who did exactly that. They were the lighthouse keepers, and many of them never left their posts, even when the war came to their doorsteps. Imagine a lighthouse on a lonely cliff, far from the nearest village. The sea heaves and sighs below, a constant, restless whisper. The wind tugs at the windows, and the foghorn moans like a great, lonely animal. Inside, the keeper winds the clockwork mechanism, trims the wick, polishes the lens. It is a rhythm older than the war itself, a heartbeat of light that guides ships through the treacherous shallows. When the war began, many lighthouses were ordered to be darkened. The fear was that the beams would guide enemy bombers or submarines, but some lights had to stay lit. They were needed for convoys, for the rescue of downed airmen, for the safe passage of fishing boats that fed the hungry islands. The keepers were told to stay, to keep the light burning, even if it meant they became targets themselves. These keepers lived in a world of their own. Their days were a slow dance of chores, checking the fuel, cleaning the glass, listening to the radio for news of the war, but mostly listening to the sea. They had no guns, no body armor, no quick escape. Their only weapon was the light itself, and their only defense was the knowledge that their work mattered. When German bombers flew overhead, the keepers would douse the lamps and wait in the dark, barely breathing. Then, when the engine noise faded, they would relight the flame and carry on. One such keeper was a man named Thomas, who tended a lighthouse on a remote Scottish island. He had been there for years before the war, and he would be there for years after. His wife had passed, his children were grown, and the lighthouse had become his home. When the war came, he was offered a chance to leave. He refused. "Who will guide the ships?" he asked. And so he stayed. Each night he climbed the spiral stairs, his footsteps echoing in the stone tower. He would light the lamp, and the beam would sweep across the dark water, a silent reassurance. Sometimes he would see a ship pass or a fishing boat, and he would know that his light had made a difference. The loneliness was immense. There were no letters for weeks, no news from the mainland, only the endless sound of the sea. But Thomas found a strange peace in the routine. He would talk to the seagulls, sing old songs to himself, and watch the stars wheel overhead. The war seemed distant, a rumor from another world. Yet he knew that every night he kept the light burning. He was part of the war effort, a quiet soldier in a battle against the darkness. Not all kept their lights on. Some were ordered to extinguish them, to leave the coast in darkness, hoping to confuse the enemy. But even then, the keepers stayed. They would hide the lenses, dismantle the machinery, and wait. They became guardians of the dark, protecting the secrecy of the land. And when the war was over, they would polish the brass and light the lamps again, as if nothing had happened. There is a story of a keeper in France, an old man who had been at his post since the First World War. When the Germans came, they ordered him to turn off the light. He refused. They threatened him. He still refused. Finally, they sent a soldier to do it themselves. The keeper stood in front of the lantern, arms crossed. "You will have to shoot me first," he said. The soldier hesitated. He saw the old man's eyes, the same eyes that had watched for ships for decades. The soldier turned and left. The light stayed on. These quiet heroes never sought fame. They were not decorated, not mentioned in dispatches. They simply did their duty, day after day, night after night. They kept the lights burning, and in doing so, they kept the hope alive. Their heroism was not in the grand gesture, but in the small, repeated acts of faithfulness. When we think of the Second World War, we think of battles, of generals, of great victories and terrible losses. But we should also think of the lighthouse keepers, alone in their towers, tending the flame. They remind us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet, steady light that refuses to go out, even when the world is full of darkness. And so, as you drift off to sleep, imagine that light. A single beam sweeping across the sea, a promise of safety, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are those who keep the light burning. Let that thought be your lullaby. Imagine the end of a long, dark storm. The world had been at war for nearly 6 years, a conflict that had touched every corner of the globe. And then, in the spring of 1945, the storm began to break. In Europe, the guns fell silent one by one as the news spread like a gentle breeze. The war was over. But even in those last, quiet moments, there was one final, strange coincidence. The very last casualty of the war, a soldier who died just as peace was about to arrive.